Marcus Johnson sat in the back of Mrs. Thompson's classroom, nervously tapping his pencil on the desk. It wasn't that he was nervous about the test, he had taken exams before, and he always did his best. No, what made Marcus nervous was the quiet, invisible expectation that hung in the air, the feeling that everyone, especially Mrs. Thompson, was waiting for him to fail. He had seen it in her eyes for weeks now. Every time he asked a question, she'd raise an eyebrow, almost as if she was surprised that someone like him, someone from his background, someone who didn't have the right last name or come from the right family, would even dare to challenge the lesson. It didn't help that Marcus was the only black student in a class full of kids who were all doing well, getting high marks, and making plans for Ivy League schools. He was used to being underestimated. But somehow, it still stung. "All right, class," Mrs. Thompson called, her voice sharp and authoritative, "I expect you to do your best on this quiz. It's going to be graded heavily, so take your time and read the questions carefully." Marcus shifted in his seat, his palms sweating. The quiz was just another challenge on top of everything else. He knew it would be harder for him to prove himself, especially with a teacher who had already made up her mind about him. The other students around him seemed unfazed. Sarah, the girl who always sat to his left, was already reviewing her notes. Kyle, the class president, was adjusting his glasses with a confident smile, as if this was another quiz he could ace without even trying. Marcus was used to their indifference, but today, it felt different. Today, it felt like more was riding on this. As Mrs. Thompson handed out the quiz, she paused briefly as she reached Marcus's desk. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, was it pity, before she placed the test in front of him. She gave him a small, almost dismissive nod, as if to say, "I don't expect much from you." Marcus could feel his heart race. He could hear the murmur of students around him, the sound of pencils scratching against paper, the clock ticking down the minutes. He gripped his pencil tightly, steadying his breath. This wasn't just another test. This was his moment. This was his chance to prove that he wasn't the kid they all thought he was. As he turned the first page of the quiz, Marcus scanned the questions. They seemed simple enough, basic math problems, some history dates, a couple of science facts. But as he read through the questions, something strange began to happen. His mind started to race, his thoughts coming faster than he could write them down. It was like the information was all there, stored in his brain, just waiting to be tapped into. The numbers, the equations, the historical events, they weren't just abstract concepts to him. They were like a code he could crack. The answers flowed naturally, almost effortlessly. For once, Marcus felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel, confident. He looked around at his classmates. Sarah was already on question 5. Kyle had flipped to the last page, scratching his head thoughtfully. They were moving fast, but Marcus wasn't concerned. He knew he could finish, and he knew he could finish well. But what if he finished too well? Marcus's thoughts shifted. What if this time, for once, Mrs. Thompson would have to acknowledge him? What if his classmates would stop thinking of him as the quiet, reserved kid from the wrong side of town? What if, for once, he could show them that he was more than just his circumstances? His hand flew across the paper, writing down answers with a speed and accuracy that felt almost too easy. For every question, he could see the answer in his mind before he even read it fully. It wasn't just the math problems. It was everything, history, science, literature. He knew it all. The world felt vast and exciting, like it was opening up to him, offering him everything he'd ever dreamed of. As the last few minutes ticked away, Marcus double-checked his answers, making sure he hadn't missed anything. He looked around again. The class was still writing, but Marcus felt a strange calm wash over him. He was finished. He stood up, handing in his test to Mrs. Thompson. She looked up, almost surprised. She didn't say anything, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made Marcus pause. Was it skepticism? Was it disbelief? He couldn't tell, but he didn't let it bother him. For once, Marcus felt like he had the upper hand. He had done his best, and for the first time, he felt good about it. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat in the cafeteria, his lunch untouched on the tray in front of him. His mind kept replaying the events of the quiz, the feeling of the answers flowing effortlessly, and Mrs. Thompson's look as he handed in the test. It wasn't like he had been trying to impress anyone, but the fact that he had done so well, maybe better than anyone else in the class, kept circling back to him. "What's up with you today?" Sarah slid into the seat across from him, glancing at his tray. "You didn't even eat." Marcus shrugged, a smile tugging at his lips. "Just not hungry, I guess." Sarah raised an eyebrow, but Marcus could see the curiosity in her eyes. "Are you sure you're all right? You're acting different." Marcus hesitated for a moment, not sure how to answer. He had always kept to himself, always kept a low profile. But today was different. Maybe it was the test, maybe it was just the way things felt in that classroom, but Marcus had a new sense of purpose. He felt like something inside of him had shifted. "I don't know," he said, the words coming out before he could think them through. "Maybe I am different." Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "Well, whatever it is, it's kinda cool. I've never seen you like this before." Marcus smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in a long time. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something big. For the first time, Marcus believed that he might actually be able to show everyone what he was really capable of. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, but Marcus wasn't ready to let the moment go. He stood up, gathering his things and heading out the door, his mind already racing ahead to the next chapter in this unexpected journey. What if this test was just the start? What if his genius was about to turn heads? Only time would tell, but Marcus felt something shift in the air around him. It was the first time in a long time that he felt like he had a chance to change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The day after Marcus finished the test, the tension in the classroom was almost palpable. It wasn't just Marcus who could feel it, but everyone. His classmates seemed to be moving with a little more purpose, their eyes a little more focused. But it wasn't just because of the test itself. It was because of Marcus. Mrs. Thompson had not yet graded the quizzes, but somehow, everyone knew. They knew something had shifted. Marcus had been a quiet student, someone who faded into the background. But the way he handed in his test yesterday, finished first, without hesitation, had everyone talking. Even if it was just for a brief moment, Marcus could feel the eyes on him. The class, which had always been a familiar rhythm, now felt different. But the person who was most affected was Mrs. Thompson. She had always been the kind of teacher who prided herself on being able to read her students, quickly discerning their strengths and weaknesses. And she had written Marcus off long ago. He was the kid who sat at the back of the class, never raised his hand, never spoke up, and never seemed to push himself. He was quiet, reserved, the kind of student who teachers expected to coast through school without making much of an impact. She didn't even really try to get to know him, assuming his quiet nature was just a result of his upbringing. She believed that someone like Marcus, a kid from a working-class neighborhood, didn't have the same opportunities as others. In her mind, it wasn't about race, it was about class. She'd seen it all too often, students like Marcus weren't expected to be stars. They didn't have the resources, the backing, or the environment to truly succeed. And it wasn't her fault. It was just the way things were. But then Marcus went and defied everything she thought she knew. The next morning, Marcus entered the classroom to a familiar sight. His classmates were chattering, laughing, exchanging notes, but the moment Marcus walked in, a quiet murmur spread through the room. Mrs. Thompson, who was busy at her desk, paused for a moment, her pen hovering in midair. Her gaze flicked up, meeting Marcus's eyes for just a brief second. Then, as quickly as it appeared, her expression shifted back to one of indifference. Marcus made his way to his seat, trying to ignore the lingering stares from his classmates. He could already feel the weight of their expectations. Would he be able to keep it up? Was he really as smart as his answer suggested? As he settled into his desk, he took a deep breath. He had to remind himself, this wasn't about proving something to them. It was about proving it to himself. For once, he wanted to believe in the genius that had been simmering inside of him all these years, hidden beneath the surface. He was determined not to let anyone, including himself, sell him short again. Mrs. Thompson began collecting the graded quizzes, her hands moving methodically as she glanced over the papers. When she got to Marcus's test, she paused. For the briefest moment, she stared at the top of his paper, at the 100 that was boldly written in red ink. Her brow furrowed in disbelief. How? It wasn't that she didn't think Marcus could have done well, it was that she didn't think he would. She had written him off before he even had a chance. His family background, his quiet demeanor, his reluctance to engage in classroom discussions, it all painted a picture for her. She had expected someone who might barely pass. Yet here it was, staring her in the face, Marcus had aced the quiz. Her fingers lingered over the paper for a moment longer than necessary, and then she moved on, her expression unreadable. But the damage had already been done. The seeds of doubt had been planted. As the class continued, Marcus tried to keep his focus on the lesson, but he could feel the subtle shift in the air. His classmates were watching him more closely, the whispers softer, but more frequent. He could almost hear their thoughts, how did Marcus pull that off? Was he really that smart? The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and Marcus stood to leave. As he packed up his bag, he noticed Mrs. Thompson lingering by the door. When he walked past her, she gave him a tight smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus, she said, her voice just above a whisper. Can I talk to you for a moment? Marcus stopped, heart suddenly racing. Was this it? Was she going to call him out? He glanced at his classmates, who were now pretending not to watch, but the looks were still there. Curious. Intrigued. Sure, Marcus replied, trying to sound calm even though he felt like his stomach was doing flips. Please, sit down. Mrs. Thompson gestured to the chair in front of her desk. Marcus hesitated, but slowly took a seat, trying not to fidget. Mrs. Thompson sat down across from him, the quiet weight of her presence making him feel even more exposed. I just wanted to say, she began, her voice a little more uncertain than usual, that you did very well on the quiz yesterday. I have to admit, I didn't expect it. You're a very bright student, Marcus. But... Marcus braced himself. He could already feel the familiar sting of an explanation, one he'd heard countless times before. But, he asked, though he had a sinking feeling he knew what was coming. But I'm curious, why haven't you shown this kind of work before? Why haven't you been participating more in class? Her voice wasn't accusatory, but there was an underlying tone of confusion. It was the tone of someone who had underestimated him, someone who still wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Marcus felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He had never been one to make excuses, but the question hit too close to home. Why hadn't he tried harder? Why had he kept his head down all this time? I guess I didn't think anyone would care, Marcus finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I just kept quiet, kept to myself, it'd be easier. No one expects much from me, so I just kept it that way. Mrs. Thompson blinked, surprised. She wasn't sure what to say at first. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before. Marcus, I'm sorry. I misjudged you. I made assumptions that weren't fair. You're a lot more capable than I gave you credit for, and I promise you that won't happen again. Marcus nodded, unsure of what to say. It felt good to hear her apologize, but he knew better than to take it as some kind of victory. People could say they were sorry all they wanted, but that didn't change the fact that he'd been overlooked for so long. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, standing up to leave. He wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let anyone underestimate him again. As Marcus walked out of the classroom, the weight that had been on his shoulders for so long seemed a little lighter. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But this was a start. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of uncertainty, hope, and curiosity. After his conversation with Mrs. Thompson, Marcus felt like something had shifted inside of him, like the first crack in a dam that would soon break open. But the real test wasn't in the apology he'd received from his teacher, nor the raised eyebrows from his classmates. It was in what happened next, the spark. The spark that would change everything. In the days following the quiz, Marcus found that he couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd never given much weight to his intelligence. Growing up in a neighborhood where people struggled to make ends meet, it wasn't the kind of thing that was ever celebrated. Most of the time, Marcus kept his head down, trying not to draw attention to himself. But after that test, after that moment when he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was more capable than everyone thought, something deep inside of him started to shift. Every day as he sat in class, he began to push himself harder. When Mrs. Thompson presented a new challenge, Marcus didn't shrink away. Instead, he jumped in, answering questions, offering ideas, and raising his hand just like everyone else. He found a surprising joy in the material he had once found intimidating, discovering that not only could he do the work, but he could do it with ease. But the shift wasn't just academic. Marcus started paying more attention to the people around him. He could see the surprised glances, the whispers when he spoke up in class. His classmates, who had never really noticed him before, now couldn't ignore him. It was as if they were seeing him for the first time. One afternoon, during lunch, Marcus was sitting alone at his usual spot when Sarah came over, her tray in hand. She sat down across from him, not saying anything at first, just looking at him with a curious expression. Marcus didn't mind. Sarah was one of the few people who didn't treat him differently, and she wasn't the type to ask probing questions. She just let things be, which was one of the things he appreciated most about her. "So," Sarah finally said, breaking the silence. "You've been kind of on fire lately. What's going on?" Marcus glanced at her, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that he hadn't noticed the way she and others were starting to pay more attention to him. He just hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. "I don't know," he said, pushing his food around on his tray. "I guess I just realized that maybe I've been holding myself back. I thought if I stayed quiet, people would leave me alone. But that quiz. It made me realize that I'm capable of more. I just have to stop thinking like everyone else expects me to." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "So, you've been hiding all this time?" Marcus shrugged, feeling a little self-conscious. "I guess. I thought I didn't matter to anyone, you know. Like, people look at me and think I'm just another kid who's not going anywhere. But I know I can do more than that." Sarah's face softened, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I always thought you were smart. But I never knew you felt like that. Honestly, Marcus, it's good to see you come out of your shell. You've got more in you than you realize." Her words made Marcus pause. Maybe Sarah wasn't the only one who saw something in him. Maybe everyone around him had been too distracted by their own expectations to notice the person he really was. And that was the hardest part, the fact that he had allowed himself to be invisible for so long, thinking it would keep him safe from judgment. Now, it felt like he was finally stepping into the light, but it was terrifying. "Thanks, Sarah," Marcus said quietly, looking down at his tray. "I don't really know what to do with it all yet, but I'm trying to figure it out." Sarah leaned back in her chair, taking a bite of her sandwich. Well, you've got a lot more than you realize. Just don't forget that. The days that followed were full of small victories for Marcus. Mrs. Thompson began to look at him differently, even calling on him more often in class. His classmates, some of whom had ignored him before, started seeking him out for help. It wasn't always easy. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the way they sometimes watched him with an almost nervous curiosity. But the more he pushed himself, the more he realized that they weren't the problem. It wasn't the expectations that were holding him back, it was his own fear. The turning point came during a project in Mrs. Thompson's class. It was an advanced group project on historical events, and as usual, Marcus was paired with Sarah. This time, however, Sarah was a little more excited than usual. "I think we can totally crush this project," she said, as they sat down together in the library to brainstorm. "We're both doing great in the class, and we're the best pair. So, let's make this one something special." Marcus couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. But as they worked together, something inside him clicked. It wasn't just about getting good grades anymore. This project wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about showing what he was really capable of. It was the first time he didn't feel the need to hide or play it safe. As they researched, Marcus found himself poring over details, coming up with ideas, and making connections between events that no one else had considered. Halfway through their research session, Sarah looked over at him, surprised. "Marcus, you're blowing my mind right now. I didn't even think of that. You're like, on a whole different level today." Marcus chuckled softly, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Guess I've got a little more to offer than I thought." As the project came to a close, Marcus was feeling more confident than ever before. His relationship with his classmates, especially Sarah, had changed. They didn't look at him like the kid who couldn't keep up. They saw him for what he was, a bright, capable student who had a lot to contribute. But the most important shift was the one that had happened within himself. Marcus realized that he had been his own biggest obstacle. He had been hiding behind a wall of assumptions, built by his past experiences and the world's low expectations. But now, he was beginning to tear that wall down, one brick at a time. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if it was all too much for him to handle. But as he saw the changes in the way people treated him, and the way he treated himself, he knew he was on the right path. Mrs. Thompson finally graded the project, and as she handed it back to the class, Marcus felt a twinge of nervousness. But when she got to his paper, she stopped, stared at the grade for a moment, then looked up at him. "Marcus," she said, her voice tinged with surprise, "you did an exceptional job. This project was one of the best I've seen this year." His heart swelled with pride. For the first time, Marcus realized that the biggest hurdle wasn't overcoming the expectations of others, it was overcoming his own. He wasn't just doing it for the grades or to prove something to his teacher or his classmates. He was doing it for himself. As the bell rang and the students filed out of the room, Marcus felt something he had never felt before, the weight of the world was a little bit lighter. It was his turn now, and he was ready to show everyone, and himself, what he was truly capable of. The spark had been lit. Now, it was time to let it grow. The weeks that followed Marcus's transformation were nothing short of remarkable. His newfound confidence, coupled with his academic success, began to reshape the way he saw the world and the way the world saw him. It wasn't just about grades anymore, it was about proving to himself, and to others, that he was more than the label people had placed on him. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he belonged. As he walked down the hallway, there was a subtle shift in the way his classmates greeted him. Instead of passing by with their heads down or avoiding eye contact, more and more of them nodded in acknowledgement, smiled, or even struck up conversations. It wasn't that they suddenly saw him as one of them, but they saw him as someone worthy of respect, someone who had something valuable to contribute. But even as things began to look up for Marcus, he couldn't shake the feeling that the spotlight was both a gift and a burden. He was proud of what he had accomplished, but the attention, while flattering, felt a little overwhelming at times. The pressure to continue performing at a high level was building, and he couldn't help but wonder, what if he couldn't keep up the momentum? What if he wasn't as brilliant as everyone thought? One afternoon, after a particularly grueling history lecture, Marcus found himself in the school courtyard, leaning against the brick wall. His mind was racing, swirling with thoughts. It had been a week since Mrs. Thompson's praise, and while it had felt amazing in the moment, now the weight of expectation was starting to creep in. Every time he turned around, someone was watching him. Someone was waiting for him to slip up. It was as if he had stepped into the role of the smart kid, and now there was no going back. "Hey, Marcus." He looked up to see Sarah approaching, a concerned look on her face. She had clearly noticed the distant expression in his eyes. "You okay?" she asked, stopping in front of him. Marcus hesitated, feeling a wave of frustration build. He wasn't used to being open about his emotions, but something about Sarah's kindness made him feel safe. He let out a deep sigh and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Sarah. Lately, it feels like everyone's waiting for me to be this perfect student, this genius. And I don't know if I can keep up with it. What if I mess up? What if I let everyone down?" Sarah smiled gently, a mix of understanding and reassurance in her eyes. "Marcus, you're not perfect. And neither is anyone else. People don't expect you to be a genius 24/7. They just want you to keep being you. The Marcus who thinks outside the box, who surprises everyone. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Her words sank in, and for the first time in days, Marcus felt a little lighter. Maybe he didn't have to be perfect. Maybe he just had to keep being the version of himself that he was discovering. After all, he wasn't doing this for the approval of others. He was doing it for himself. The next morning, during class, Mrs. Thompson announced a surprise group project. The students groaned collectively. Group projects were always a mixed bag, with some students eager to take charge and others hoping to fly under the radar. For Marcus, though, it was an opportunity. He was determined to prove that the work he had done so far wasn't a fluke. As she read off the names of the group pairings, Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The last name on the list, Marcus Green and Jake Williams. Jake Williams was the class clown. The guy who never took anything seriously. The one who, despite his obvious intelligence, preferred to coast by on charm rather than hard work. Marcus's stomach churned. He had heard rumors about Jake's reputation. He was popular, charismatic, but not someone who cared much about grades. Marcus had no idea how he was going to work with him. He didn't want to be stuck carrying the project, but he also didn't want to clash with Jake. As the bell rang and the students gathered their things, Jake sauntered up to Marcus with a casual grin. "Hey man, looks like we're partners. Let's make this project a breeze, yeah." Marcus forced a smile. "Sure, Jake. But we'll need to take it seriously. Mrs. Thompson said this project's a big deal." Jake waved him off, his grin widening. "Don't worry about it, dude. I've got this. I'll handle the presentation part. You focus on the research. You're the brain, I'm the face. It's a perfect match." Marcus wasn't sure how he felt about that, but he didn't have much of a choice. It was clear that Jake was going to take charge of the more public-facing part of the project, and he would have to do the heavy lifting in terms of the research. Though he didn't like the idea of being the brains, while Jake got all the credit, Marcus figured it was better than doing the entire project on his own. The following days were filled with tension as Marcus worked diligently on the research portion of the project, digging into sources and crafting an outline. He quickly realized that Jake wasn't quite as invested as he had claimed to be. Every time Marcus asked for Jake's input, Jake would brush him off with some excuse about being busy or needing to work on his part. It wasn't long before Marcus found himself in the library alone, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. He could feel the frustration building within him, but he kept his head down and pushed forward. He wasn't about to let Jake's laziness ruin this opportunity. Finally, the day of the presentation arrived. As the students gathered in the classroom, Marcus glanced over at Jake, who was adjusting his shirt and fixing his hair in the reflection of the classroom window. It was clear that Jake was more concerned with his appearance than with the project itself. When it was their turn, Marcus and Jake stood up in front of the class. Marcus felt his heart race as he began to speak, presenting the research he had meticulously gathered. But as he spoke, he realized something that made his stomach drop. Jake was barely paying attention. Instead of contributing to the discussion, Jake was leaning against the desk, checking his phone, and laughing with a few friends in the back of the room. Marcus's frustration boiled over. This was it, the moment he'd been working for. The moment when he could show everyone what he was capable of. And Jake was treating it like a joke. But Marcus didn't back down. He pressed on, speaking with passion and clarity, determined to make sure the work he had done didn't go unnoticed. As he wrapped up the presentation, he looked at Mrs. Thompson, who was watching intently. Her eyes flickered with something that Marcus couldn't quite place. When the class ended, Mrs. Thompson asked Marcus to stay behind. "You did an excellent job, Marcus," she said quietly, her voice filled with admiration. "I can tell how much work you put into this. You went above and beyond what was asked of you." Marcus felt a small surge of pride, but also a sense of frustration. He knew that Jake hadn't contributed as much as he should have. But he also knew that this wasn't about Jake. This was about him. About his potential. And from that moment on, Marcus realized that no one could ever hold him back, except himself. He had proven something, not to anyone else, but to himself. He was more than just the quiet kid at the back of the class. He was a force to be reckoned with. And he was just getting started. After the group project and the moment with Mrs. Thompson, Marcus had hoped things would settle down. He'd stood his ground, done his part, and had been praised for his hard work. But the praise wasn't the only thing that lingered in the back of his mind, it was the subtle but growing realization that being noticed, really noticed, came with a new set of challenges. There was an invisible line he had crossed. The spotlight, which had once felt like a comfortable cloak, now weighed heavier with each passing day. Marcus had always prided himself on blending in, on being overlooked. It was easier that way. But now, as people began to recognize his potential, he was forced to face something that had been buried deep inside him for years: fear. Fear of failure. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being the person people thought he was, or worse, being someone he didn't recognize. And though Marcus tried to push those feelings away, they lingered, especially when the classroom filled with the sounds of his classmates discussing their latest assignments. One morning, as Marcus sat at his desk in Mrs. Thompson's class, waiting for the bell to ring, he overheard a conversation between two of his classmates, Emily and Kevin. They were talking about him. It wasn't unusual for people to talk about Marcus lately, but this conversation felt different. "He's really smart, isn't he?" Emily said, sounding surprised. Kevin shrugged, but there was something in his voice that sounded almost resentful. "Yeah, but have you seen him act like he actually cares? It's like he's playing everyone. I wouldn't trust a guy like that." Marcus's stomach twisted, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He had hoped that the attention he was getting would be positive, but the reality was that it brought out the worst in some people. There was always someone who couldn't handle seeing someone else succeed, someone who preferred to bring others down to feel better about themselves. He didn't know how to respond to those kinds of thoughts. The accusations didn't feel right, but there was a seed of doubt planted in his mind. Was he really being himself? Or had he just become another person, someone who was trying to fit into a mold that others had created for him? The bell rang, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. He sat up straight as Mrs. Thompson entered the room, holding a stack of papers in her hands. She glanced at the class, her eyes briefly meeting Marcus's before she began speaking. "Good morning, class. Today, we're going to discuss your upcoming midterms. I know that many of you have been putting in a lot of hard work, and I want to remind you that this exam is an opportunity to show what you've learned. Marcus couldn't help but feel his heart rate pick up. The midterms were always a big deal, but this year felt different. There was more on the line. He had proven himself with the quiz and the project, but this would be the real test. Not just in terms of academic ability, but of his own character. Could he rise to the occasion? Or would the weight of everyone's expectations crush him? After Mrs. Thompson finished her announcements, the class began to quiet down. Marcus grabbed his notebook and pen, trying to focus, but the nagging thoughts about Emily and Kevin's conversation kept resurfacing. Were they right? Was he just trying to prove something to others, or was he doing this for himself? Later that day, Marcus went to his locker after school, only to find Sarah waiting for him. She looked up with a knowing smile, as though she had sensed his unease. "You good?" she asked, her voice casual but concerned. Marcus hesitated before responding, shaking his head. "I don't know. I overheard something today. People are talking about me. Some of it's good, but some of it makes me feel like I'm pretending, you know. Like I'm just trying to play the part of the smart kid, but I'm not really that person." Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his words. "What are you talking about? You've always been smart. The only difference now is that you're letting people see it. That's the real change." "I don't know," Marcus muttered, leaning against his locker. "What if I'm just pretending to be something I'm not? What if I'm not really smart, or talented, or whatever they think I am?" Sarah stepped closer, her tone soft but firm. "Marcus, you're not pretending. You've always been capable. You just needed to believe in yourself. It's not about what others think of you, it's about what you think of yourself. And the truth is, you've earned every bit of the attention you're getting. People see the work you're doing, the effort you put in, and that's what's drawing them to you." Marcus looked up at her, feeling a sense of clarity starting to form. Maybe she was right. Maybe the problem wasn't that people saw him differently, it was that he hadn't fully accepted the person he was becoming. "I guess I've been so focused on what others expect of me that I forgot to check in with myself," Marcus admitted. "I just don't want to disappoint anyone." Sarah gave him a reassuring smile. "Look, you can't control what other people think. All you can control is what you do. And you're doing great. You don't have to live up to anyone else's idea of who you should be. Just be you. That's all you need to do." Marcus nodded, feeling a weight lift off his chest. Sarah's words had a way of cutting through his doubts, reminding him of something important: he was his own person, and his worth wasn't determined by the opinions of others. That evening, Marcus sat at his desk, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks, and study materials. The midterm was coming up, and while he felt the pressure mounting, he also felt a new sense of calm. It wasn't about proving something to the world. It wasn't about living up to anyone else's expectations. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. As the hours ticked by, Marcus poured his focus into his studies, his mind sharp and clear. He realized that he wasn't alone in his struggles with self-doubt. Everyone, even the most confident people, had their moments of uncertainty. The key wasn't avoiding those doubts, but learning to push through them, to keep moving forward even when the road ahead seemed unclear. That night, as he closed his books and prepared for bed, Marcus made a promise to himself: he would no longer hide. He wouldn't let fear or doubt control his future. He was ready to step into the person he was meant to be, and he wouldn't apologize for it. Tomorrow was a new day, a new chance to show the world, and himself, what he was truly capable of. And this time, he was going to do it on his own terms. The day of the midterm had arrived. Marcus woke up early, the weight of the test pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had spent countless hours studying, memorizing facts, practicing problems, and trying to retain everything he could. But no amount of preparation could entirely calm the nerves that twisted in his stomach. It wasn't the test itself that worried him, it was the fear of not living up to his own expectations. He stood in front of his mirror, trying to steady his breath. The reflection staring back at him was someone who had already proven to himself that he could do great things. But despite his efforts to reassure himself, doubt lingered, clinging to his thoughts like a shadow. "Don't overthink this," Marcus muttered to himself, putting on his jacket and heading out the door. The school day felt like it dragged on, every minute inching toward the inevitable. Marcus couldn't shake the thoughts that kept circling in his mind. What if I mess up? What if I let everyone down? But with each passing moment, he also realized that he was stronger than he had ever been before. He wasn't the same person he had been just a few weeks ago. He was someone who had faced his fears, pushed through his doubts, and had succeeded because he believed in himself. Still, as he walked into Mrs. Thompson's classroom, his palms were sweaty, and his heart was racing. The room was filled with the usual hum of students preparing for the test. There was an air of nervous anticipation, but also a quiet sense of camaraderie. Everyone was in the same boat now, and for the first time, Marcus didn't feel entirely alone. Mrs. Thompson handed out the test papers, her usual calm demeanor making everything feel just a bit more manageable. She gave a brief, encouraging smile as she did so, then returned to her desk. The test was long and challenging, filled with a mixture of multiple choice, short answer, and essay questions. As Marcus worked through each question, he found himself falling into a rhythm. His hand moved quickly across the paper, and his mind seemed to unlock each answer as though it had always been there. Every problem he faced felt like something he could solve, something he could tackle and figure out. But then, near the end of the test, there was a single question that stopped him cold. It was an essay prompt, and it was one he hadn't anticipated. The question asked, "What is the greatest challenge you faced in your life, and how did you overcome it?" Marcus froze. The words blurred together for a moment as his mind raced. The question hit harder than he expected. It wasn't about academics, it wasn't about grades, or tests, or anything external. It was personal. For the first time, Marcus had to confront something much deeper than the material he had studied. What was his greatest challenge? It wasn't his grades, or the way people saw him. It was something more profound, his fear of not being enough, his constant battle against the doubt that always lurked in the back of his mind. He stared at the question, his pen hovering over the paper. Could he answer honestly? Could he write about his journey, about his struggles with self-doubt, and about the way he had slowly, but surely, begun to believe in his own worth? Marcus took a deep breath. It wasn't about giving the right answer. It was about giving the real answer. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of the test, Marcus was exhausted, mentally and emotionally. He handed in his paper, feeling both relieved and uncertain. What would Mrs. Thompson think of his answer? What would his classmates think of him for revealing so much of himself? But deep down, he knew that the real victory wasn't in the test itself, it was in his ability to face the question, to be vulnerable, and to answer with the truth. The days that followed felt like an emotional roller coaster. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the test and his answer. He had tried to push it out of his mind, but every time he saw Mrs. Thompson in the hallway, or when he passed by his classmates, his thoughts returned to that essay. What if he'd made the wrong choice? What if he had overexposed himself? What if his honesty had opened the door to more judgment? It wasn't until the following Friday that Marcus finally got the chance to see his test results. As he entered Mrs. Thompson's class, he noticed that the test papers were stacked neatly on the front desk. She was already handing them out, giving each student their paper with a brief nod of acknowledgement. Marcus's heart raced as he approached the desk, unsure of what to expect. When Mrs. Thompson handed him his paper, her eyes met his, and she gave him a small smile. "Well done, Marcus," she said softly. He glanced at the grade at the top of the paper, an A+. But it wasn't the grade that mattered most. It was the comment she had written in the margin next to his essay response. "Marcus, this was a beautifully written answer. You've shown a level of self-awareness and maturity that most students don't reach until much later in life. Keep believing in yourself. You've got something special." Tears pricked at Marcus's eyes. For a moment, the weight of everything he had been carrying, all the doubts, the struggles, the fears, all seemed to fade away. Mrs. Thompson had seen him, not just as a student, but as a person. She had recognized the growth he had been working so hard to achieve. After class, Marcus walked down the hallway, his mind reeling. He had done it. He had faced his fears head-on and had come out the other side stronger. The midterm had been a pivotal moment, not just in his academic journey, but in his personal growth. As he stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, Sarah caught up to him. She had been waiting for him, a knowing smile on her face as she looked at his paper. "So, how'd you do?" she asked, her voice light but eager. Marcus grinned. "I think I did all right. Actually, better than all right." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Better than all right?" Marcus handed her the paper, and she glanced at the grade before looking up at him. Her smile widened. "I knew it," she said with a laugh. "I told you that you had it in you." Marcus felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. But more than that, he felt something else, something new. For the first time, he truly believed in himself. This wasn't just about being smart, or proving others wrong, or earning praise. It was about accepting who he was, flaws and all, and knowing that he was enough. And as the leaves swirled around him in the autumn breeze, Marcus felt ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead, because he knew he could handle it. He wasn't just Marcus Green, the student who was underestimated. He was Marcus Green, and he was unstoppable. The weeks following the midterm passed by quickly. Marcus found himself walking a fine line between confidence and caution. After his impressive performance on the test, the whole school seemed to have noticed him. His classmates were treating him differently now. There was a mixture of respect, curiosity, and maybe a little envy. But as much as Marcus appreciated the newfound attention, it made him feel uneasy. He didn't like the idea of being put on a pedestal, or worse, having everyone expect him to maintain some kind of perfection. Still, there was one thing he could rely on, his relationship with Sarah. She had been by his side through it all, offering a listening ear, advice, and a steady stream of encouragement when things felt too overwhelming. Sarah didn't see him as just the smart kid or the project leader, she saw him as Marcus, his struggles, his doubts, and his potential. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in the school courtyard during lunch, Sarah dropped into the seat across from him. He had been lost in thought, watching the other students chat and laugh, when Sarah waved her hand in front of his face. "Earth to Marcus," she teased. "You okay? You've been staring into space for like 10 minutes. Marcus blinked, coming out of his trance. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, folding her arms across her chest and leaning back in her chair. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just, this whole thing with the midterm. People keep looking at me differently, and I don't know how to feel about it. I don't want to disappoint anyone. And I can't help but feel like everyone is expecting me to be perfect all the time." Sarah smiled knowingly. "You're doing great, Marcus. But I get it. The pressure can be a lot. Just remember, you're not in this to live up to anyone's expectations but your own." Marcus nodded, appreciating her words, but a part of him still felt unsettled. There was a subtle shift in the way people saw him, and while he liked the respect, he wasn't sure he was ready for the spotlight. "Well," Sarah continued, breaking him from his thoughts, "I know you're worried about all this pressure, but I think it's time you take on a new challenge." Marcus looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What kind of challenge?" "I'm talking about joining the academic decathlon," she said, her voice full of excitement. "It's a team competition, and you'd be perfect for it. You've got the brains, and honestly, you've been kind of flying under the radar. This could be the perfect way to really show everyone what you're made of." Marcus hesitated. The idea of a competition, especially one that involved a team, was intimidating. What if he couldn't live up to the expectations? What if the team failed because of him? I don't know, Sarah, he said slowly. It's a big commitment. And honestly, I don't know if I'm ready for something that big. I mean, everyone's already looking at me after the midterm. What if I let them down? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. Marcus, you've got what it takes. You proved that with the midterm. You don't have to do this alone, you'll be working with a team. But this time, you'll be pushing yourself even further. You've already shown you can handle pressure. This will only help you grow more. Marcus thought for a moment. He had always been someone who avoided being in the spotlight, someone who preferred to work quietly in the background. But Sarah had a point, maybe it was time to push himself out of his comfort zone. Okay, I'll give it a shot, he said, surprising himself with his own answer. But no promises. The next day, Marcus found himself standing in front of the academic decathlon sign-up sheet. His heart raced as he stared at the list of names. This was it, the opportunity to take on a new challenge, to face his fear of failure head-on. The decathlon was a rigorous competition, involving everything from math and science to literature and history. It required months of preparation, teamwork, and intense focus. But what made it even more daunting was the fact that it would be a public competition, something that would test his limits in ways he hadn't yet experienced. Are you sure you're okay with this? Sarah asked as they stood next to the sign-up sheet. This is a huge commitment. You'll be on a team with other kids from school, and it'll be a lot of pressure. Marcus looked down at the sign-up sheet again. He could feel his pulse quickening. It was easy to back out, to avoid the spotlight, to stay in his safe little bubble. But that wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. He had already come so far, and if he wanted to continue growing, he had to push past the boundaries of his comfort zone. I'm sure, he said, taking a deep breath. I'm ready. He picked up the pen and signed his name at the bottom of the sheet. It was a small act, but it felt like a major step towards something bigger. The next chapter of his story was about to begin. In the weeks that followed, Marcus threw himself into the decathlon preparation. It was intense, challenging, and at times, overwhelming. But it was also exactly what he needed. His team, made up of students from different grade levels, came together in ways he hadn't expected. There were moments of frustration, especially when they couldn't agree on certain strategies or when they struggled to pull together for group study sessions. But slowly, Marcus began to see the value of teamwork. He realized that he didn't have to do everything on his own. The team was there to support each other, to fill in the gaps where one person struggled. As the competition day drew nearer, Marcus's confidence grew. His classmates had started to view him as a leader in their study sessions. They trusted his input, and he had become the go-to person for many of the questions that came up. But even though he had learned to embrace his role, the pressure was still there. He knew that this was a major opportunity, and failure wasn't an option. But with every passing day, Marcus's fear of failure started to fade. He began to see that the true challenge wasn't about the outcome of the decathlon, it was about his willingness to step into the unknown, to push past his insecurities and embrace the person he was becoming. And as the day of the competition approached, Marcus felt ready, not just to prove something to others, but to prove something to himself. He was more than just the smart kid. He was a leader. A team player. And, most importantly, he was someone who believed in himself. The day of the academic decathlon arrived, and Marcus's nerves were at an all-time high. His alarm clock blared early that morning, the sound pulling him from an uneasy sleep. He lay in bed for a few moments, letting the weight of what lay ahead settle in. This wasn't just a test of his knowledge, it was a test of his growth. His entire journey had been leading up to this moment, and there was no turning back now. He dressed quickly, barely noticing what he was putting on as his mind raced with thoughts of the competition. What if I mess up? What if I let my team down? But then he remembered what Sarah had told him in the weeks leading up to this. It's not just about winning. It's about pushing yourself further than you've ever gone before. The competition was being held at a nearby university campus, and Marcus's team had to arrive early for the opening ceremony. When he walked into the school gym that morning, he was hit with a wave of excitement and anxiety. Teams from other schools were already gathering, chatting, and getting ready for the first round of events. The air was thick with anticipation as students of all grades gathered to face off in a battle of wits. The decathlon would take place in several rounds, each focusing on different subjects. There were team events, like the group math and science competitions, as well as individual challenges, such as the history and literature exams. It was everything Marcus had been preparing for, and now it was time to face the test. As Marcus met up with his team, Sarah, Liam, and a few other students, he noticed the tension in the air. Everyone was on edge, nervous, but there was also a sense of camaraderie. They were all in this together, and for the first time, Marcus realized that this was more than just an academic challenge. It was a chance for each of them to prove something to themselves. "All right, team," said Sarah, clapping her hands together to gather everyone's attention. "This is our time. We've practiced hard, we've studied hard, and now it's time to show everyone what we can do. No matter what happens, we've got each other's backs. Let's do this." Her words helped calm the team's nerves, and Marcus felt a wave of confidence wash over him. He wasn't alone. They had worked together through the preparation, and now it was time to put everything they had learned into action. The first event was the math competition. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken as he sat down at one of the desks, the paper in front of him filled with complex equations and word problems. He had always been good at math, but these problems were no joke. The clock was ticking, and he could feel the pressure mounting. He took a deep breath, glancing at his teammates for reassurance. Sarah, Liam, and the others were all focused on their own work, their expressions tense but determined. Marcus quickly turned his attention back to the paper and began to work through the problems. At first, the equations seemed daunting, but as he went along, he began to unlock the answers. His mind, which had once been clouded with self-doubt, was now clear. He knew this material. He had practiced it. And most importantly, he was no longer afraid to fail. As the last few minutes of the round ticked away, Marcus found himself finishing the final question with time to spare. He glanced at the others, who were all still scribbling away. He couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. He had done his part, and now all he had to do was wait for the results. The next few rounds of the decathlon came and went, each one more challenging than the last. There was a round of science questions that tested their understanding of physics and chemistry. Another round on literature, where they had to identify key themes and characters from classic novels. Each time Marcus faced a new challenge, he felt the pressure building, but he also felt the sense of fulfillment that came with pushing past it. Throughout it all, Sarah remained a steady presence, helping the team stay calm and focused. Liam, too, proved to be an asset, offering insights and strategies when they needed them most. Even though Marcus had been hesitant to join at first, he now realized that this was exactly what he needed. The teamwork, the problem-solving, the challenge, it was all part of what made him feel alive. As the final round approached, the pressure reached its peak. This was the round that would determine the winner. The teams were exhausted, their brains fried from hours of intense competition. Marcus could feel his mind beginning to slow down, but he pushed through it, knowing that this last event would be the deciding factor. It was a history exam, something Marcus had always excelled in. As the questions appeared on the screen in front of him, he felt a renewed sense of confidence. This was his time to shine. He breezed through the first few questions, identifying key historical events and figures with ease. But then, the questions started to get more complicated. There were questions about obscure historical facts and dates, and Marcus found himself second-guessing some of his answers. He glanced at his teammates, who were deep in concentration, their brows furrowed with determination. They were relying on him, and he couldn't afford to let them down. Time was running out, and Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He had to focus. He had to push through the fatigue and the doubts creeping into his mind. With only a few minutes left, he made his final decision on the last few answers, filling in the remaining blanks. When the time was up, he dropped his pencil and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment. He had given it everything he had. The results weren't announced until later in the day. As Marcus sat with his team, anxiously awaiting the final tally, he couldn't help but feel a mix of exhaustion and pride. Win or lose, they had all pushed themselves further than they ever thought possible. They had faced their fears, embraced the pressure, and fought together as a team. Finally, the announcer stepped onto the stage, and the room fell silent. The tension was palpable as the results were revealed. Our second-place team, the announcer began, from Crestwood High School. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Had they done it? And in first place, the winners of this year's academic decathlon, the announcer continued, from Bayview High School, the team of Marcus Green and his incredible teammates. Marcus's jaw dropped. His team had won. As his teammates erupted into cheers and applause, Marcus felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. They had done it. They had won. It wasn't just about the trophy, though, it was about everything they had accomplished together. They had faced their doubts, pushed through the pressure, and emerged victorious. And as Marcus stood on that stage, holding the trophy in his hands, he realized that he had just completed one of the most important journeys of his life. He had proven not only to his school, but to himself, that he was capable of greatness. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The spotlight didn't seem so intimidating anymore. The weeks following the victory at the academic decathlon felt like a blur. The school buzzed with excitement, and Marcus found himself walking the halls with an entirely different sense of confidence. His classmates no longer saw him as just the quiet, bookish kid. He was now the student who had led his team to victory, and everyone had taken notice. Even teachers who had once underestimated him now looked at him with a new level of respect. Yet, as much as he appreciated the recognition, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something even bigger. The decathlon had been a defining moment in his life, a reminder that he was capable of far more than he had ever realized. But now that the pressure of that competition had passed, he wondered what came next. What would his next challenge be? And how could he continue growing without falling back into the safety of his comfort zone? One afternoon, as Marcus sat in the library, absorbed in a textbook, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. He didn't need to look up to know it was Sarah. She had a way of walking that was both confident and calming, a presence he had come to rely on over the past few months. "Hey," Sarah greeted him, sliding into the seat across from him. "Got a minute?" "Yeah, of course," Marcus said, closing his book. "What's up?" "I've been thinking," Sarah began, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "You've done so well with the decathlon, and I know you're starting to feel the pressure of everyone's expectations. But I think it's time you took the next step." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Next step? What do you mean?" "I mean, it's time for you to go after something bigger," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "You've proven yourself academically, but I think you're ready for more. There's an opportunity coming up for a summer research program at the university. They're looking for talented students in fields like science, technology, and engineering." Marcus blinked. He had heard about the program. It was selective, and only a handful of students were chosen each year. It was a prestigious opportunity, and he knew it would open doors for college applications and future career prospects. "But I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "It's intense, and honestly, I've been comfortable just staying in my lane. I'm not sure I want to push myself that far." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "Marcus, that's exactly why you should go for it. You're more than capable. You've already shown that. But if you don't take the chance now, you might never get another one like it." Marcus sat in silence for a moment, considering her words. He had always been someone who avoided the spotlight, someone who preferred to keep things low-key. But Sarah was right, he had proven that he could handle pressure. The decathlon had taught him that. And this summer research program was exactly the kind of opportunity he needed to push himself further. "Okay," he said, finally meeting Sarah's gaze. "I'll do it. I'll apply." The application process was rigorous. Marcus spent hours filling out forms, writing essays, and gathering recommendation letters from teachers who had seen his growth over the past year. Each part of the process pushed him to reflect on his journey, how far he had come, and how much further he still wanted to go. As he submitted his application, a sense of nervous anticipation settled over him. The waiting period felt like an eternity. Every time his phone buzzed, he found himself checking it, hoping for some sign of acceptance. And then, one afternoon, the email finally came. He sat in front of his computer, staring at the subject line, Summer Research Program Acceptance. With a trembling hand, he clicked open the message. His heart raced as he read through the email, his eyes scanning the words. "Congratulations, Marcus Green. We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected for the summer research program at Bayview University. We were impressed by your academic achievements and your passion for learning." A wave of disbelief and joy washed over him. He had done it. He had been accepted. The first day of the summer research program felt like stepping into a whole new world. The campus was beautiful, full of modern buildings and cutting-edge labs. Marcus couldn't help but feel a little out of place. The other students, many of whom had already worked in advanced research environments, seemed far more experienced than him. But as he entered the main hall for orientation, he reminded himself that he had earned this opportunity. He was here because of his dedication, his hard work, and his willingness to take risks. The program director, Dr. Evelyn Moore, was a renowned researcher in the field of genetics. Her impressive credentials made Marcus feel even more intimidated, but her welcoming smile put him at ease. "Welcome, everyone," Dr. Moore began, addressing the group of students. "This summer, you'll be immersed in real-world research projects. We'll be exploring everything from artificial intelligence to environmental sustainability. You're here because we believe in your potential, and we can't wait to see what you'll accomplish." As the program began, Marcus was assigned to a team working on a project related to renewable energy. The challenge was to design a more efficient solar panel using innovative materials. At first, the complexity of the task seemed overwhelming. He wasn't sure he had the expertise to contribute to such a high-level project. But slowly, he began to find his place. He had the foundational knowledge, math, science, problem-solving, that allowed him to quickly grasp the concepts being discussed. And as he worked alongside his team, he realized that his contributions were valuable. He was no longer the quiet kid in the background. He was a crucial part of something groundbreaking. In the evenings, when the workday ended, Marcus would sit alone in the lab, reviewing data and conducting experiments. He found himself feeling more alive than ever before. The work was challenging, but it was exactly the kind of challenge he had been looking for. He was learning so much, not just from the project, but from the people around him. His teammates were brilliant, and they pushed him to think outside the box, to be creative and innovative in ways he had never imagined. By the end of the program, Marcus had developed a new sense of confidence. The experience had given him a taste of the future he wanted, one that involved hard work, collaboration, and making a tangible impact on the world. He had started this journey not knowing where it would lead, but now, he saw a clear path forward. When Marcus returned to school in the fall, everything had changed. He wasn't the same person who had entered the academic decathlon months ago. He had grown, not just in his academic abilities, but in his sense of self. He was no longer afraid of pushing himself to his limits. In fact, he was excited to do so. He had learned that growth came from stepping into the unknown, from embracing challenges that pushed him beyond what he thought was possible. His teachers noticed the change in him. His classmates did too. But most importantly, Marcus noticed it within himself. He wasn't just the quiet, underestimated kid anymore. He was someone who had proven to himself that he could accomplish anything he set his mind to. The journey was just beginning. And this was only the first chapter. As the new school year began, Marcus found himself grappling with the aftermath of his summer research program. He had returned to school with a renewed sense of purpose, but also with a deeper understanding of the challenges that lay ahead. While he was proud of what he had accomplished over the summer, he knew that the journey to truly making an impact was only just beginning. The first week back was a whirlwind. Marcus was determined to stay on top of his studies while also continuing to push himself beyond his comfort zone. But despite his growing confidence, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was still something missing, someone who could guide him in the way Sarah and his research mentors had. He was doing well, but he knew he had the potential to do so much more. It wasn't until the third week of school that Marcus encountered someone who would change everything for him. It was during a particularly tough physics class. The material was challenging, and Marcus found himself struggling to keep up. His mind was clouded with thoughts of his recent research project, and he couldn't quite shake the sense of doubt creeping back in. He had always been good at science, but this class felt different, more advanced, more difficult. For the first time in months, he questioned his ability to succeed. At the front of the room, Mr. Jacobs, his physics teacher, paced back and forth, explaining the principles of thermodynamics with his usual enthusiasm. Mr. Jacobs had always been one of Marcus's favorite teachers, but today, even his energy seemed to blur into the background of Marcus's own inner turmoil. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Marcus grabbed his things and headed toward the door. Just as he was about to leave, Mr. Jacobs called out to him. "Marcus, can I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus hesitated but then turned around, walking back toward the front of the room. "Sure, Mr. Jacobs. What's up?" "Take a seat," Mr. Jacobs said, pointing to the empty chair in front of his desk. Marcus sat down, trying to suppress the nervousness bubbling in his stomach. Was he in trouble? "I noticed you seemed distracted today," Mr. Jacobs began, leaning back in his chair. "I can tell when something's on your mind. You've been doing well in this class, but today, you didn't quite seem like yourself." Marcus sighed. He wasn't used to being the center of attention in this way. "I guess. I just don't feel like I'm keeping up. The material is really hard, and I'm not sure I'm getting it as quickly as I should." Mr. Jacobs studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I get it. Physics can be tough, especially when you're pushed to think in new ways. But you've got something a lot of students don't have, you've got the drive. And that's what makes the difference in the long run." Marcus felt his heart rate pick up a bit at the mention of drive. He had heard those words before, usually from Sarah. But hearing them from a teacher he respected so much made them feel different. "Why don't we meet after school tomorrow?" Mr. Jacobs continued. "I think there's more to you than you realize. I'd like to help you find your stride." Marcus blinked in surprise. "You would? I mean, I'd really appreciate that, but I didn't know you had the time." "I always have time for students who want to push themselves," Mr. Jacobs said with a smile. "Just come by after school, and we'll work through some of the concepts you're struggling with. I'll make sure we get you on track." The next afternoon, Marcus walked into the classroom after school, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Mr. Jacobs was sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers and textbooks, but when he saw Marcus walk in, he looked up with a welcoming smile. "Glad you made it," Mr. Jacobs said, motioning for Marcus to take a seat. "Let's get started, shall we?" For the next hour, Marcus and Mr. Jacobs worked through the physics problems that had been plaguing him. At first, the material still seemed overwhelming, but Mr. Jacobs's teaching style was different from what Marcus was used to. He didn't just present the information in a sterile, textbook way, he took the time to explain the concepts from multiple angles, using real-world examples to make the material feel more relevant. "You see, Marcus," Mr. Jacobs said as they worked through a particularly tricky thermodynamics equation, "the key is to break it down into smaller pieces. Don't let the big picture intimidate you. Focus on one step at a time. Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath as he tried to process the information. Slowly, the fog of confusion began to lift. With each explanation, he found himself understanding the material a little bit more. "You're starting to get it," Mr. Jacobs observed. "That's the breakthrough moment. The more you practice, the more it will come naturally." By the time the session was over, Marcus felt a surge of confidence he hadn't felt in weeks. Physics no longer seemed like an insurmountable mountain, it felt like a puzzle he could solve with enough time and effort. "Thanks, Mr. Jacobs," Marcus said, standing up to gather his things. "This really helped." "I'm glad," Mr. Jacobs replied. "But remember, this isn't just about physics. This is about how you approach challenges in general. You've got the potential to go far, Marcus. But it's going to take work, and more importantly, it's going to take persistence." As Marcus left the classroom, his mind buzzed with thoughts of the future. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving school, he was actively learning, growing, and reaching for something greater. And Mr. Jacobs had just become the kind of mentor he had been searching for. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of late-night study sessions, group projects, and a renewed focus on his studies. Every time Marcus faced a difficult challenge, he thought back to the advice Mr. Jacobs had given him: break it down. Focus on one step at a time. It became his mantra, a way to tackle even the most overwhelming tasks. But as much as Marcus had come to rely on his new routine, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was about to change again. He had worked so hard to prove himself to everyone around him, but now, he had to prove something even more important, that he could keep pushing forward, even when the next challenge seemed just out of reach. He knew there were more hurdles ahead. There would be obstacles, setbacks, and moments of self-doubt. But Marcus was no longer the same person he had been a year ago. He was different now, stronger, more focused, and ready to take on whatever came his way. And with his mentor, Mr. Jacobs, by his side, Marcus knew that anything was possible. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The fall semester was steadily moving forward, and with each passing week, Marcus found himself becoming more integrated into the academic world that had once seemed so daunting. He had adjusted to the pressures, the long hours of study, and the seemingly endless tests and assignments. But, there was something bigger on the horizon, a challenge that would push him further than he had ever imagined. It started with a simple email. It was early one Tuesday morning when Marcus opened his inbox to find a message from the school's guidance counselor. He had seen her around campus, but had never really interacted with her outside of the occasional visit to the office. The subject line of the email caught his attention immediately: exclusive scholarship opportunity for high-achieving students. He clicked on the message and quickly scanned the content. Dear Marcus, we are excited to announce an exclusive scholarship opportunity for students who have demonstrated exceptional academic achievement and promise. This scholarship is for highly motivated individuals who are looking to further their education in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. The deadline for applications is fast approaching, and we believe you would be a great candidate for this scholarship. The selection process is competitive, and we encourage you to apply if you are serious about continuing your academic journey at the university level. Please visit the link below to apply, and do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Best regards. Ms. Jenkins, Guidance Counselor. Marcus's heart raced. A scholarship opportunity like this could be the key to attending the prestigious university he had dreamed of. He had worked so hard, but paying for college had always been one of his biggest concerns. The thought of not being able to afford his education had lingered in the back of his mind, but now, this scholarship might be the lifeline he needed. But then the self-doubt crept in. What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail? The voice of doubt was familiar, but this time, Marcus didn't let it take hold. He had learned too much over the past year to let fear dictate his decisions. This was a chance, and he couldn't afford to pass it up. That afternoon, Marcus met with Sarah after school at their usual spot by the bleachers. "Hey, guess what?" Marcus began, holding up his phone with the email open. "I just got an email about a scholarship opportunity." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Really? That's awesome. What's the catch?" "There is no catch," Marcus explained. "It's for students who excel in STEM fields. It's competitive, but if I get it, it could cover most of my college expenses." "That sounds amazing," Sarah said, her eyes brightening with excitement. "You should definitely apply. You've worked so hard for this, Marcus. You're ready for it." Marcus looked down at the email again, contemplating the next steps. "Yeah, I know I'm ready. But I'm still kind of nervous. I mean, this is a huge opportunity, and what if I'm not enough?" "Marcus, stop," Sarah said, gently placing a hand on his arm. "You are more than enough. I've seen what you can do. You've already proven yourself. This is just the next step in your journey. If anyone deserves this scholarship, it's you." Her words, as always, were exactly what he needed to hear. Sarah had been his biggest supporter, and he couldn't imagine going through this process without her encouragement. "Thanks, Sarah," Marcus said, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "I'm going to apply. No more second guessing." The application process for the scholarship was intense. Marcus had to write a personal statement, detailing his academic journey, his passions, and why he believed he deserved the scholarship. He also needed to gather recommendation letters from teachers who could vouch for his work ethic and academic achievements. It was a lot of work, but it was a challenge Marcus was eager to face. He spent the next few days writing and refining his essay, pouring his heart into every word. He wanted to make sure the scholarship committee understood who he was, not just as a student, but as a person. He knew that this wasn't just about grades or test scores, it was about his journey, his perseverance, and his commitment to making a difference in the world. By the time he submitted the application, Marcus felt both exhausted and proud. He had given it his all, and now all he could do was wait. The weeks that followed were a mix of anxious anticipation and focused determination. Marcus continued to excel in his classes, keeping up with his studies while balancing extracurricular activities. But no matter how busy he was, the thought of the scholarship lingered in the back of his mind. One Friday afternoon, as he was packing up his bag in the library, he received another email. This one had the subject line, "Scholarship Application Status, Decision Notification." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He clicked the email open and read the message quickly. "Dear Marcus, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a finalist for the STEM scholarship. Congratulations on reaching this stage in the selection process. As a finalist, you will be required to attend an interview next week with the scholarship committee. The interview will give us an opportunity to learn more about your academic achievements, future goals, and the impact you hope to make in your field of interest. Please review the attached documents for further instructions. We look forward to meeting with you. Best regards. Ms. Jenkins. Guidance Counselor." Marcus sat frozen for a moment, processing the words on the screen. He had made it to the final round. He had no idea what the interview would entail, but he knew one thing: this was the opportunity of a lifetime. The following week, Marcus prepared for the interview with the same intensity he had used to study for exams and complete his research project. He reviewed his personal statement, practiced answering potential questions, and reflected on his academic journey. He wanted to make sure he was ready for whatever the committee might ask. When the day of the interview arrived, Marcus dressed in his best clothes, a simple, but sharp, button-up shirt and dress pants. He walked into the guidance office, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. The scholarship committee was composed of professors from the local university and a few key administrators from the school. "Marcus, it's great to see you," Ms. Jenkins greeted him with a warm smile. "Please, have a seat. We're excited to hear more from you." The committee members were friendly, but the interview felt intense. They asked about his academic accomplishments, his future plans, and how he planned to use his education to make a difference in the world. Marcus answered each question with honesty and passion, sharing his love for science, his desire to push boundaries, and his dream of one day working in renewable energy. At the end of the interview, Marcus felt a sense of relief. He had done his best, and he knew he had presented himself authentically. Now, it was out of his hands. A few days later, Marcus received another email. This time, his heart raced in anticipation. He opened it quickly. "Dear Marcus, we are thrilled to inform you that you have been selected as the recipient of the STEM scholarship. Your application, interview, and accomplishments stood out to the committee, and we are confident that you will continue to excel in your academic journey. We look forward to supporting you as you pursue your education at Bayview University. Congratulations once again. Best regards. Ms. Jenkins, Guidance Counselor." Marcus's hands shook as he read the email. He had done it. He had earned the scholarship. His first instinct was to share the news with Sarah. She had believed in him every step of the way, and now he had the opportunity to continue his journey, thanks to her unwavering support. "Sarah, I got it," Marcus said when he saw her later that day. "I got the scholarship." Sarah's face lit up with joy. "I knew you would. You deserve this more than anyone." For Marcus, this wasn't just a scholarship, it was a testament to everything he had worked for. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where the possibilities seemed endless. And with that, the next phase of his journey was ready to begin. The weeks following Marcus's scholarship win were a blur of excitement and preparation. He could hardly believe that his dream of attending college was finally within reach. With the scholarship secured, he knew he could focus entirely on his studies and personal growth, free from the financial worries that had once seemed insurmountable. But even as he reveled in the accomplishment, something else lingered in the back of his mind, the reality that this was just the beginning. The journey that lay ahead would require more than just intelligence and academic excellence. It would require determination, resilience, and a deep sense of purpose. And Marcus knew that he wasn't just going to college to earn a degree, he was going to change the world. As he settled into his final year of high school, he found himself reflecting on everything he had learned. From the moments of self-doubt in the early days of his academic career to the breakthroughs in his summer research program and the guidance he had received from mentors like Mr. Jacobs, Marcus had grown in ways he never expected. He had learned that intelligence wasn't the only thing that defined success, it was the persistence, the drive, and the willingness to ask for help when needed that set people apart. One afternoon in October, Marcus sat in the school library, reviewing notes for his upcoming physics test. He was on a roll, focused and confident, but there was still that quiet excitement bubbling inside him. His future was beginning to take shape in ways he hadn't imagined when he first walked through the doors of Bayview High. That's when Sarah found him. She appeared in the doorway of the library with a grin on her face, holding 2 coffees in her hands. "Hey, nerd," she teased, walking toward him with a playful glint in her eyes. "Thought you might need a break from all those equations." Marcus chuckled as he took the coffee she handed him. "Thanks, Sarah. I swear, the amount of studying I've been doing lately is starting to make my brain hurt." "I can imagine," she said, settling into the chair next to him. "But you've got this. You're going to crush that test." Marcus smiled, appreciating the confidence she always seemed to have in him. "Yeah, I'm feeling good about it. But honestly, I can't stop thinking about what happens next. I got the scholarship, but now it's all real. College is right around the corner." "I know what you mean," Sarah said thoughtfully, sipping her coffee. "It feels like we're standing on the edge of something huge. It's like we've been waiting for this moment for so long, and now we're about to jump." Marcus nodded. He had spent so much time focusing on the present and on making sure his grades stayed up, but now, with the scholarship secured, the future seemed so much more tangible. The weight of his decisions, his ambitions, and his goals began to settle on his shoulders. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt ready. "So, what's next for you?" Marcus asked, curious about what Sarah had in mind for her own future. Sarah leaned back in her chair, looking thoughtful. "Well, I'm applying to a couple of art schools. I've been working on my portfolio for months now, and I'm finally feeling good about it. I want to pursue art, but I'm not sure where that will take me yet. It's kind of scary, but I know it's what I want." Marcus smiled, proud of Sarah's courage. She had always been the artist, the dreamer, while he had been the scientist, the thinker. But despite their different paths, they always seemed to have each other's backs. "I have no doubt you'll get in," Marcus said. "You've got talent, Sarah. More than anyone I know." She grinned at him. "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot." For the rest of the afternoon, they studied and talked about their plans for the future, sharing their hopes, fears, and dreams. It was comforting to know that they would be facing these new challenges together, even if their journeys would take them in different directions. College was just the first step, but they both knew that their friendship would carry them through whatever came next. The weeks continued to fly by, and before Marcus knew it, graduation day arrived. The ceremony was held on a warm June afternoon, and the entire school was buzzing with excitement. It was a bittersweet day, full of pride, but also filled with a sense of finality. The friends, the teachers, the memories, everything that had made his high school experience so unique was coming to an end. But at the same time, it was the beginning of something much bigger. As Marcus sat in his cap and gown, waiting for the ceremony to begin, his mind wandered back to the early days of high school. He had been nervous then, unsure of his place, unsure of his abilities. But now, as he looked around at the sea of faces, he realized how far he had come. He had worked hard to get to this point, and now, he was ready to take on whatever came next. The principal's voice boomed through the loudspeakers, calling the students to attention. Marcus stood up along with his classmates, his heart pounding with excitement. It was time. The ceremony was a blur of speeches, handshakes, and the familiar sound of the crowd cheering as each name was called. When Marcus's name was announced, he walked across the stage, shaking hands with the principal and accepting his diploma. It was a moment of pure triumph, and as he stood in front of the crowd, his family cheering wildly in the audience, he couldn't help but smile. This was it. This was the moment he had been working for. After the ceremony, Marcus found Sarah waiting for him in the crowd. She was beaming with pride, her eyes sparkling as she rushed over to him. "You did it," she said, throwing her arms around him in a hug. "I knew you would." "I couldn't have done it without you," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, we have. And I'm so proud of everything you've accomplished. You've earned this, Marcus." They stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the noise, the excitement, the promise of the future. It felt like the end of one chapter, but also the beginning of something even greater. In the weeks that followed, Marcus prepared for his transition to Bayview University. The reality of college life began to settle in. He was excited, of course, but he also knew there would be new challenges ahead. But this time, he was ready. He had the tools, the support, and the determination to succeed. As the day of his departure drew closer, Marcus reflected on everything he had learned. He had faced adversity, overcome self-doubt, and found mentors who believed in him. He had learned that success wasn't just about being smart, it was about working hard, staying true to yourself, and never giving up. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more obstacles, more challenges to face. But Marcus had come so far. And nothing, not even the toughest of hurdles, could stand in his way now. The horizon ahead was full of promise, and Marcus was ready to meet it head-on. Marcus stepped off the bus onto the campus of Bayview University, a place that now felt both daunting and exciting. The sprawling campus stretched out before him, with towering buildings, lush green lawns, and students bustling from one place to another. It was his first day, and everything felt new. He could hear the hum of conversations, the distant sound of laughter, and the rustling of leaves in the trees. It was an environment full of opportunity, an environment where he could finally prove what he was capable of. He adjusted the straps on his backpack and took a deep breath, trying to steady the excitement that was bubbling up inside him. A part of him still couldn't quite believe he was here, on the verge of starting a new chapter in his life. But there was another part that was ready. He was prepared for whatever was to come. After everything he had worked for to get here, he couldn't afford to waste this chance. As he walked through the campus, he passed students who seemed to be in their own worlds, some chatting with friends, others buried in their phones or textbooks. Marcus could feel the weight of his ambition as he passed each group, but it wasn't a heavy burden. It was a reminder of how far he had come, how much he had overcome, and how much he was capable of. His first stop was the admissions office, where he needed to pick up his student ID and some other documents. The line was short, and after a few minutes, he was handed his official ID. He smiled when he saw the picture. He didn't look like the same young man who had first walked into Bayview High a few years ago, uncertain of who he was or where he was going. This was a new version of himself, more confident, more focused, and ready for whatever came next. He checked his schedule and saw that his first class was Introduction to Physics, held in the main lecture hall. As he made his way across campus, his mind raced with anticipation. This was his field. This was where his passion lay. He had always known that he wanted to pursue something related to science, and physics was where he felt most at home. When Marcus entered the lecture hall, he was taken aback by how large it was. Hundreds of students were seated, chatting quietly, and a few professors were milling about at the front, setting up equipment for the day's lesson. His heart raced. This was real. He was no longer in high school, no longer a big fish in a small pond. This was university, a place where everyone had their own ambitions, their own dreams. Everyone was here to make their mark. Marcus was just one student among many, but he didn't let that intimidate him. As he took his seat, he glanced around and spotted a few empty seats near the front of the room. Marcus liked to sit toward the front. It helped him stay focused and engaged. He made his way to one of the empty spots and set down his backpack, feeling the familiar thrill of a new beginning. The professor, a tall man in his mid-40s with graying hair, walked up to the podium. He looked around the room and cleared his throat. The chatter subsided, and the lecture hall fell silent. "Good morning, everyone," the professor said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Welcome to Introduction to Physics. I'm Professor Harris, and I'll be guiding you through the fascinating world of physics this semester." Marcus leaned forward, eager to hear more. Professor Harris had a presence about him, calm, collected, but also passionate. His energy was contagious, and Marcus found himself hanging on to every word. "We'll cover a wide range of topics," Professor Harris continued, "from the basics of classical mechanics to the more complex concepts of quantum physics. I expect you to be challenged, to think critically, and to work hard. If you do, I have no doubt you'll succeed." The lecture began, and Marcus immediately felt at home. The material was challenging but exciting, and the way Professor Harris explained each concept made it all seem so clear. The principles of motion, force, and energy, they were all things Marcus had studied before, but here, in this setting, they came to life in a way he had never experienced. As the lecture ended, Marcus gathered his things and headed out of the lecture hall, his mind buzzing with excitement. It felt like the first step towards something much bigger than himself. He was officially a college student, a part of a community of thinkers and creators who were pushing the boundaries of knowledge and understanding. The first few weeks of university were a whirlwind. Marcus threw himself into his studies, spending hours in the library, poring over textbooks, and reviewing his notes. He quickly learned that college was nothing like high school. The workload was much heavier, and the expectations were higher. But Marcus was up for the challenge. He had always been the type to rise to the occasion, and he knew this was just another test of his perseverance. He found that university life was about balance. While his classes were demanding, there were also moments to enjoy the new experiences. He attended club fairs, where he learned about different student organizations. He joined the science club, hoping to find like-minded peers who shared his passion for innovation and discovery. But, more importantly, he also made time to reconnect with his old friends from high school. One weekend, he met Sarah at a local coffee shop near campus. The place was bustling with students and locals, but Marcus immediately spotted her sitting by the window, a cup of tea in front of her. "Hey, stranger," Sarah greeted him with a smile, standing up to give him a hug. "How's college life treating you so far?" "It's intense," Marcus said, sitting down across from her. "The work is non-stop, but I'm getting the hang of it. Physics is as challenging as I thought it would be, but I'm loving it. The professors here really know their stuff." "That's awesome to hear," Sarah said, taking a sip of her tea. "I'm doing okay too. Art school is, well, it's different from what I imagined, but I'm starting to figure things out. I think I'm finding my place." "Good," Marcus said with a smile. "You always had a clear vision, even when things seemed uncertain. I know you'll do great." They spent the next hour talking about their experiences, catching up on everything that had changed since high school. Sarah had made new friends at art school, and they shared stories of their respective journeys. But Marcus found himself reflecting on the ways their paths had diverged. Sarah was still the creative dreamer, pouring herself into her art, while he was buried in equations and scientific theories. But no matter how different their journeys were, they remained each other's biggest supporters. They had both come so far, and they had both worked so hard to get where they were. And no matter where their lives took them, they knew they would always have each other's backs. As the conversation came to an end, Marcus stood up and grabbed his jacket. "I'll see you around, okay?" "Of course," Sarah said, smiling warmly. "We've got this." Marcus left the coffee shop with a renewed sense of purpose. College was everything he had hoped for and more. It was challenging, yes, but it was also filled with endless possibilities. As he walked back to campus, he couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something amazing, something that would shape the rest of his life. The future was waiting, and Marcus was ready to meet it head-on. As the weeks slipped by, the rhythm of college life began to settle in for Marcus. The initial excitement of new beginnings had given way to a more routine pace. Early mornings spent in the lecture hall, late nights in the library, and weekends in the study group rooms had all become part of his new normal. The campus felt less foreign, the professors less intimidating, and his classmates, while still strangers, were beginning to feel more like peers. However, Marcus had known from the start that it wouldn't always be smooth sailing. The reality of university life had its challenges, and he was about to face one of his toughest tests yet, the first major exam in Physics 101. The announcement had come during the previous lecture, when Professor Harris had stood before the class with his usual steady, calm demeanor. "The first midterm will be next Friday," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "This exam will cover everything from Newton's laws to energy conservation. It's important that you study the material thoroughly. The questions will test not just your ability to memorize formulas but your understanding of the principles behind them." As soon as the words left Professor Harris's lips, Marcus's mind went into overdrive. This wasn't just another test, it was his first big challenge in university, and the pressure to do well was palpable. His academic record had always been solid, but now he was in a new league, surrounded by some of the brightest minds he'd ever encountered. It was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking at the same time. For the next few days, Marcus threw himself into his studies with a level of intensity that was borderline obsessive. He memorized equations, practiced problems from the textbook, and watched online lectures for additional clarification. He barely noticed when the days began to blur together, the hours slipping away as he buried himself in his notes. But as the days passed, something started to nag at him. The pressure, while motivating him to push harder, was also starting to take its toll. His sleep had become irregular, his energy was low, and even his meals had started to feel like chores. It was the first time since coming to college that Marcus began to doubt himself. What if I'm not ready for this? He thought to himself late one night, as he sat hunched over his textbook in the library. The clock read 2 a.m., and fatigue was weighing heavily on his eyelids. The equations seemed to blur together, and his mind was no longer as sharp as it had been during the first few days of studying. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his spiral of self-doubt. It was a message from Sarah. "Sarah, you good? Haven't heard from you all week." Marcus quickly typed back, his fingers hesitating as he tried to put his feelings into words. "Marcus, I'm fine, just a little stressed. Midterm coming up on Friday. Trying to keep up, but I'm starting to feel like I'm losing it." The reply came quickly, as it always did with Sarah. "Sarah, hey, you're gonna crush it. Just breathe, okay? You've got this. You've always done well when you really focus, right? But don't forget to take care of yourself too. No test is worth your health." Her message made him stop. He hadn't realized just how much he'd been neglecting himself. The stress had consumed him so much that he hadn't even noticed how rundown he was. But Sarah was right. He needed to find a balance, his health, his well-being, and his studies. With a deep breath, Marcus closed his textbook and stood up from the library desk. He stretched his back and walked outside into the cool night air. The campus was quiet, the only sounds being the soft rustling of the leaves and the distant hum of traffic. It was peaceful, almost surreal. He took a few moments to clear his head, letting the cool breeze wash over him. He needed to reset, to remind himself that this wasn't the end of the world. One test wasn't going to define him. When he returned to his dorm later that night, Marcus made a commitment to himself. He would study hard, yes, but he wouldn't sacrifice his well-being in the process. He would aim for balance, knowing that even if things didn't go perfectly, he could learn from his mistakes and keep moving forward. The next day, Marcus took a new approach to his studies. He woke up early, not to cram in more material, but to go for a run around the campus. It was the first time he had taken a step back in days, and the fresh air and movement cleared his mind. When he returned, he ate a proper breakfast, something he hadn't done in days, and then got back to his physics problems with renewed focus. The following days were still challenging, but Marcus felt a sense of control over his anxiety. He didn't attempt to cram everything in at once, but instead broke the material down into manageable chunks, focusing on one concept at a time. He spent time reviewing notes with his study group, quizzing each other on formulas and problem-solving strategies. Sarah checked in regularly, offering words of encouragement and light-hearted distractions when needed. Their conversations, though brief, kept him grounded, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this. He wasn't just a lone student on a journey, he was part of a network of people who cared about him and wanted to see him succeed. By the time the day of the exam arrived, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm. He had done everything he could. He had studied, practiced, and prepared himself for this moment. There were no more doubts in his mind, only the knowledge that he was ready. The exam was long and grueling, just as he had expected. The questions challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but he remained focused, methodical, and confident. Every time a difficult question arose, he paused, took a deep breath, and reminded himself of the work he had put in. When he handed in his paper at the end of the exam, there was a sense of relief that washed over him. The test was over. He had done his best, and that was all he could ask for. A week later, the results were posted online. Marcus hesitated before clicking the link, his heart pounding in his chest. When the page finally loaded, his eyes scanned the screen quickly. He had scored an 88%. It wasn't a perfect score, but it was more than enough. He had passed the test, and in doing so, he had proven to himself that he could handle the pressure of college academics. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Sarah. "Sarah, told you you'd crush it. How'd you do?" Marcus grinned and quickly typed back. "Marcus, 88%. Not perfect, but I'm happy with it. Thanks for the pep talk, I needed it." "Sarah, anytime. You're going places, Marcus. Keep it up." As he looked at his score and read Sarah's message, Marcus couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He had faced his first major test in college and emerged stronger than before. He wasn't just learning about physics, he was learning about himself, about resilience, and about what it truly took to succeed. And this was only the beginning. The weeks following his midterm exam were a blur of lectures, assignments, and late-night study sessions. For Marcus, the adrenaline of his first college test had worn off, replaced by the constant pressure to maintain his momentum. Every class, every textbook, every problem set was another hurdle to overcome. It wasn't that he regretted pursuing this path, it was still everything he had dreamed of. But the reality of it was starting to feel heavier than he had anticipated. Physics was demanding, as expected. Each new concept built on the previous one, and though Marcus grasped most of it with ease, some of the more complex topics began to chip away at his confidence. The pace of the course was unforgiving. There were assignments every week, each one more intricate than the last, and while he managed to get good grades, there was always that nagging feeling that maybe he wasn't doing his best. He was doing what was required, but was it enough? At times, he found himself doubting his abilities. There were moments when he would look around at his classmates in the lecture hall, students who seemed to grasp the material effortlessly, and wonder if he truly belonged here. It was the classic impostor syndrome, that feeling of not being good enough, no matter how much evidence there was to the contrary. The pressure mounted as the next big assignment loomed on the horizon, a group project on classical mechanics. Marcus had always been a strong individual worker, preferring to solve problems on his own, but this project required collaboration. And that meant he had to rely on others. He met his group members in the library a few days after the assignment was handed out. There were 3 others in the group: Emma, a quiet but incredibly sharp student who sat near the front of the class, Jacob, a laid-back guy with a good sense of humor, and Leah, a highly driven student with a reputation for excelling in group settings. Marcus couldn't help but feel a bit out of place among them. They all seemed so confident, so well organized, and so prepared. "Okay, so we're tackling Newton's laws and how they apply to real-world scenarios," Leah said, as she spread out the materials on the table. "We need to come up with a clear, practical example of these laws in action. Marcus, you'll be handling the calculations for the first part, right?" Marcus nodded, already feeling the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had no problem with the math, he knew it was his strong suit. But he also understood that the project was more than just numbers. It was about teamwork, about contributing to the bigger picture. He felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. "We're meeting again tomorrow to check in," Leah continued, "and we'll need a draft by the end of the week. Let's make sure we stay on track." Everyone nodded in agreement, and with that, the meeting broke up. As Marcus walked back to his dorm, he couldn't shake the feeling that the project was just another thing to add to his already full plate. It wasn't the work itself that worried him, it was the constant balancing act. Every part of his life felt like it was pulling him in a different direction, and he was starting to feel the strain. The next few days were a blur of late-night study sessions, group meetings, and running from one class to the next. Marcus threw himself into the project, working through the calculations and trying to keep up with the demands of his other courses. He was meticulous, checking and rechecking every formula, making sure everything was accurate. But the more he worked, the more his stress built. The deadlines, the expectations, the constant pressure to perform at his best, it was all starting to take a toll. One afternoon, after an exhausting study session in the library, Marcus collapsed onto his bed, drained. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah again. "Sarah, how's everything going? You surviving?" Marcus stared at the message for a moment, then typed back. Marcus, it's a lot. Group project, midterms coming up, and I feel like I'm drowning in work. I just can't seem to catch my breath. Sarah, I get it. College isn't easy. But remember, it's okay to ask for help if you need it. You don't have to do everything on your own. Marcus paused. It was a message he had heard 1,000 times before, but it still didn't make it any easier to follow. He had always prided himself on being independent, on handling his problems alone. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe he couldn't do this alone. He stared at the message for a long time, reflecting on everything that had been weighing on him. It wasn't just the project. It was the unrelenting pressure to succeed, the fear of failing, and the constant comparison to his peers. He wasn't just trying to pass anymore, he was trying to prove something. To himself, to his family, to everyone who had ever doubted him. As he lay there, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, he felt a sharp pang of anxiety in his chest. His body had been trying to tell him something for a while now, he hadn't been taking care of himself. The late nights, the skipped meals, the constant stress, it was all starting to catch up to him. He sat up and rubbed his eyes, realizing that he needed a break. Even if it was just for an hour, he needed to step away from everything. He grabbed his jacket and walked outside, hoping that a bit of fresh air would help clear his mind. It wasn't until the weekend that Marcus finally allowed himself to relax. He spent the afternoon at the park, walking along the trails, enjoying the crisp air and the vibrant colors of fall. The simple act of walking, of being outside and disconnected from the chaos of his academic life, helped him gain some perspective. He realized that he had been so caught up in trying to prove himself that he had forgotten to take care of his own well-being. On Monday, he decided to talk to his group about his concerns. He couldn't continue to pretend like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "Hey, guys," Marcus said, meeting his group in the library. "I just wanted to say I've been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately. I know this project is important, and I'm committed to doing my part, but I might need a little extra help with the workload." Leah, ever the leader, gave him a sympathetic look. "Marcus, we get it. We're all feeling the pressure, but we're a team. We'll make sure you're not carrying all the weight. If you need any help with the calculations or just need a break, just say the word." Emma, who had been quiet up until then, nodded in agreement. "We've got your back, Marcus. Let's work together on this." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone in this after all. His group had his back, and more importantly, they understood that college wasn't just about academics. It was about finding balance, and asking for help when needed wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. As the group worked together on the project, Marcus realized that this was another crucial lesson he had learned: it wasn't just about surviving college. It was about growing, about understanding when to push forward and when to take a step back. It was about learning to lean on others when you needed to, and giving yourself permission to take care of your mental and physical health. By the time the project was finished, Marcus felt more confident, not just in his abilities as a student, but in his ability to navigate the challenges of life. The pressure wasn't going away, but he was learning how to manage it. And that, he realized, was part of the journey. As the semester continued, Marcus found himself adjusting to the relentless pace of college life. The pressures that had once felt insurmountable now seemed a little more manageable. He had learned to take a step back when needed, to ask for help, and to rely on his friends and study group when things got tough. Yet, despite all the progress he had made, there was still one thing that Marcus hadn't anticipated: how much his relationships with the people around him would evolve. Marcus had always been somewhat reserved when it came to making deep connections. He had his friends back home, his family, and a few acquaintances here on campus, but he wasn't one to easily open up to new people. College, he had figured, would be no different. He would focus on his studies, keep his head down, and get through it. But then there was Sarah. Sarah had become a constant in Marcus's life since the start of the semester. While she was the one person who had known him before all of this, before the pressure of grades, the stress of new beginnings, and the doubts that kept him up at night, she was also the one who had helped him navigate the challenges that came with college life. And it wasn't just the words of encouragement that she offered, though those had certainly been invaluable, it was the way she listened. The way she understood him without judgment. Marcus couldn't help but appreciate how different Sarah was from anyone else he had known. Her ability to balance her own responsibilities while offering support to those around her was something that he admired deeply. She seemed to have her life together, something Marcus had yet to figure out for himself. And though they had only known each other for a few months, Marcus found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. It started with small things, a shared cup of coffee during a study session, a text message at the end of a rough day, a laugh during an unexpected moment of relief. Over time, their friendship had grown into something deeper. They had become a kind of anchor for each other in the chaos of college. Sarah was always there when Marcus needed to talk, when he needed a break from the pressure, or when he just needed someone to remind him that he was doing okay. But as Marcus found himself leaning on Sarah more and more, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had never been one to rely on someone so heavily, and a part of him feared that it might make him vulnerable. He didn't want to seem weak. He didn't want to admit that he needed someone, especially someone who had her own life to navigate. One chilly evening in late October, Marcus sat in his dorm room, working through another set of physics problems. The clock on his desk read 10:30 p.m., and while he could feel his eyes growing heavier, he refused to take a break. His mind was buzzing with equations and the weight of unfinished work. But then his phone buzzed again. Sarah had sent a message. "Sarah, you're still up. I thought I told you to take a break." Marcus chuckled quietly and texted back. "Marcus, I can't. Got to finish this set. Midterm coming up, and I need to make sure I'm prepared." "Sarah, that's what you said last night. And the night before. Marcus, you can't keep going like this. You're going to burn out." Marcus paused for a moment before responding. He didn't want to admit it, but Sarah was right. The pressure had been building, and he could feel the exhaustion seeping in. "Marcus, I know. It's just hard, you know. Everything feels like it's on the line. I've got to make it through this semester, or I'll fall behind." There was a long pause before Sarah replied. "Sarah, you're not alone in this, Marcus. You don't have to carry all the weight by yourself. You've got me, and you've got your friends here. It's okay to slow down." The sincerity in her words hit Marcus harder than he expected. It wasn't just that Sarah was telling him to relax, it was the way she had consistently been there for him. It wasn't about keeping score or being perfect, it was about being real, about supporting each other through the ups and downs. For a moment, Marcus thought about their friendship and what it had become. He had never imagined he would become so close to someone in such a short time, but here he was, leaning on Sarah more than he ever thought he would. The thought made him feel vulnerable, but also strangely comforting. "Marcus, thanks, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you." The reply came quickly. "Sarah, you do just fine, but I'm glad you don't have to do it alone." Marcus smiled at the message, feeling a warmth spread through him. Despite everything, the challenges, the stress, the pressure, he was starting to understand something important. It wasn't just about succeeding academically. It was about finding a balance, about knowing when to push yourself and when to ask for help, and most importantly, it was about the people who stood by you along the way. As the semester trudged on, Marcus and Sarah spent more time together, studying side by side in the library, taking late-night walks around campus, and occasionally grabbing a meal together. Sarah had become someone he could talk to about more than just schoolwork. She was someone he could share his fears, frustrations, and dreams with. Slowly, their friendship began to evolve into something more, though neither of them were ready to fully admit it. It was during one of their late-night study sessions that the unspoken connection between them became even more apparent. They were sitting in a quiet corner of the library, surrounded by textbooks and notes, their heads bent over their work. Marcus had just solved a particularly difficult problem and leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. "You're getting better at this," Sarah said, smiling as she glanced over at him. Marcus grinned, feeling a mix of pride and relief. "Yeah, well, I've had a lot of practice." Sarah's eyes met his, and for a moment, the usual banter between them seemed to fade. There was something more in her gaze, something deeper. Marcus's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly looked away, his mind racing with thoughts he hadn't fully allowed himself to process until now. "Hey, I'm gonna grab a coffee. Want anything?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking the silence. "Just some water, I think," Marcus replied, trying to act casual despite the sudden flutter in his chest. As Sarah stood up to go to the vending machine, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. What was happening between them? Was this just the pressure of college life making him feel more connected to her, or was there something more? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: Sarah was no longer just a friend. She had become a constant, someone who made everything feel a little more manageable. And that, Marcus realized, was a connection he didn't want to lose. As he waited for her to return, he couldn't help but smile to himself. Maybe, just maybe, the unexpected connections in life were the ones that meant the most. Marcus woke up the next morning feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The lingering exhaustion from the past few weeks, the pressure of his grades, and the growing emotional tension between him and Sarah all seemed to culminate into a single, overwhelming feeling: burnout. He had been pushing himself so hard, trying to juggle everything, trying to maintain his perfect grades, stay on top of every assignment, and still manage to be there for his friends and family. But now, more than ever, he felt like he was crumbling under the pressure. He had barely slept the night before, spending hours in the library trying to finish up a physics assignment that he knew wasn't his best work. It wasn't just the academic stress that was getting to him, though, it was everything. The looming midterms, the deadlines, the uncertainty about his future. Marcus had always been a perfectionist, but now, that need to succeed was suffocating him. As he trudged through his morning routine, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep going at this pace. His usual enthusiasm for the challenges ahead had been replaced with dread. Every test felt like a battle he wasn't sure he was prepared to win, and every piece of homework was just another stone in the path leading to his inevitable collapse. When he arrived at his physics lecture, he was barely able to focus. The professor's voice was a distant hum, his words floating past Marcus's tired ears as his mind wandered to the mountain of tasks he still needed to tackle. The realization was sinking in slowly: he couldn't keep up this charade much longer. He had to make a change, or he was going to lose it. After the lecture, Marcus found Sarah waiting outside the classroom, as she often did. She waved and smiled when she saw him, but the cheerfulness didn't quite reach her eyes. Marcus could tell something was off, though he wasn't sure what. "Hey," Sarah greeted him, her voice soft. "How's it going?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. He didn't want to burden her with his stress, but at the same time, he knew she could see through his facade. He was exhausted, mentally and physically, and it was beginning to show. "I'm okay," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite feel genuine. "Just a lot on my plate, you know." Sarah studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing as if she was trying to read him. "Marcus," she said gently, "you've been saying that a lot lately. And you don't look okay. Are you sure you're all right?" It was then that something inside of him snapped. All the emotions, all the pressure, all the fear of failure came rushing to the surface. He had been holding it all in for so long, trying to stay composed, trying to keep up appearances. But in that moment, standing there with Sarah, he realized he couldn't keep pretending. "I'm not all right," Marcus confessed, his voice cracking slightly. I'm barely hanging on, Sarah. I can't keep doing this. I'm failing. Not in school, necessarily, but, in everything. I don't feel like I'm in control anymore. Like everything's slipping away. The words felt like a release, a cathartic exhale after holding his breath for too long. For a moment, there was silence between them, and Marcus felt the weight of his own vulnerability. It was the first time he had said the words out loud, and it felt like a weight had been lifted, though the heaviness was still there, pressing down on him. Sarah didn't say anything at first, and Marcus thought maybe he had said too much, opened up too quickly. But then she placed a gentle hand on his arm, her expression soft and understanding. "Marcus," she said quietly, "you don't have to do this alone. I can't imagine how much pressure you're under, but you don't have to carry it all by yourself. You've been pushing yourself so hard, and I know you want to succeed, but that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice your well-being. It's okay to admit that it's too much. It's okay to need help." Marcus swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. He had always been so self-reliant, so determined to prove himself, but in that moment, Sarah's words cut through the noise in his mind. Maybe he didn't have to do it alone. Maybe it was okay to lean on someone else, to ask for help. He let out a long breath, his body finally relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to find balance. I don't know how to ask for help without feeling like I'm failing." Sarah smiled at him, a soft, knowing smile. "It's not failing, Marcus. It's part of being human. We all need help sometimes. You don't have to be perfect all the time. I've got your back, okay?" Marcus nodded slowly, feeling a surge of gratitude toward her. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just about school. It wasn't just about grades or exams or impressing his professors. It was about taking care of himself, recognizing his limits, and allowing himself to be human. He wasn't a robot. He didn't have to do everything on his own. "I'm really lucky to have you in my corner," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah's smile widened, and she squeezed his arm reassuringly. "We all need someone to lean on, Marcus. And I'm happy to be that person for you. But you've got to take care of yourself, too." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the bustling campus fading into the background. Marcus realized just how much Sarah had meant to him over the past few months. She wasn't just a friend, she had become a lifeline. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe things could get better. The rest of the day was a blur of lectures and assignments, but Marcus carried Sarah's words with him like a shield. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his own. He could ask for help. He could take breaks. He could lean on the people who cared about him. By the time he returned to his dorm room that night, he had made a decision. The next day, he would talk to his professors about extending a few deadlines. He would take a step back from the constant grind and focus on his mental health. And most importantly, he would give himself permission to be imperfect. As he settled into bed that night, Marcus felt a flicker of hope that had been absent for weeks. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was no longer facing it alone. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he could breathe. And that, he realized, was the first step toward finding his way through the storm. Marcus woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't that the challenges ahead had magically disappeared, but there was a subtle shift in his mindset. He had decided that he would no longer let the weight of his ambitions crush him. Instead, he would face the pressures head-on, but with a new understanding, he didn't have to carry everything by himself. There were people in his life who cared about him, people who wanted to help him succeed, not just academically, but personally. The first step, he knew, was to talk to his professors. The constant stream of deadlines and assignments had begun to overwhelm him, and he realized that the only way he would make it through was by being honest. So, after breakfast, he walked to his first lecture of the day with a notebook full of questions and concerns, his mind already rehearsing the conversations he was about to have. In his physics class, Professor Hayes greeted him with a smile as he sat down. He had always been kind and patient with Marcus, but this time, Marcus could feel his nerves building. He had to be vulnerable, something that didn't come naturally to him. But he took a deep breath and, as soon as class ended, approached the professor. "Professor Hayes, do you have a minute?" Marcus asked, trying to steady his voice. Professor Hayes nodded. "Of course, Marcus. What's on your mind?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, but then he decided it was time to be honest. "I've been struggling with the workload lately. I know I've been keeping up, but it's been really tough. I think I might need some extra time on the upcoming assignments. I don't want to fall behind, but I'm feeling stretched too thin." There it was. He had said it. It wasn't the most comfortable conversation, but it was real. Professor Hayes looked at him thoughtfully, then smiled. "Marcus, I appreciate your honesty. It's not easy to admit when you're feeling overwhelmed, especially with how hard you've been working. I can give you an extension on your upcoming assignments. But I also want to remind you that it's okay to reach out for help when you need it. Don't be afraid to ask for support." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had expected to be met with resistance, or worse, judgment. Instead, he had been met with understanding. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to him. "Thank you, Professor," Marcus said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Take care of yourself, Marcus," Professor Hayes added as Marcus turned to leave. "You're doing great. Don't forget to take a breath every now and then." Later that day, Marcus met up with Sarah in the student center. They had been texting back and forth, and he had shared his conversation with Professor Hayes. Sarah, ever the supportive friend, was thrilled by the news. "You did it," she exclaimed when he sat down. "I knew you could. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness, Marcus. It's a sign of strength. You recognized you were at your limit, and you took the steps to get the support you needed." Marcus smiled, feeling the warmth of her words sink in. "I was so nervous, though. I didn't want to seem like I couldn't handle things. But talking to him was the best decision I could have made." Sarah leaned in, her eyes bright with encouragement. "Exactly. And you've been so hard on yourself. It's okay to not be perfect, Marcus. You're allowed to have moments when you need to slow down and recharge." Marcus nodded slowly, feeling the weight in his chest ease a little. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could see a way forward. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but he had a support system. He had Sarah, his professors, and even his friends who had been rooting for him. And that, he realized, was something he hadn't fully understood before. The importance of community. Of leaning on others, even when it was hard. The next few days were a turning point for Marcus. With the extensions on his assignments, he was able to slow down and focus more effectively on his work. He found time to go for a run, to meet with friends, and most importantly, to take care of himself. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. And it felt different. Lighter. During one of their late-night study sessions, Marcus and Sarah were sitting at a table in the library. They were going over some calculus problems, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was no tension between them, no underlying anxiety. It was just the two of them, working side by side. Sarah glanced up at him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know," she said, "I've noticed a change in you. You seem more relaxed. Like you're letting go of some of that pressure you've been carrying." Marcus paused, looking at her with a small smile. "Yeah, I think you're right. I've learned that I don't have to do everything alone. And it's okay to take a break when I need one. I've been so focused on doing well that I forgot to take care of myself in the process." "You're getting it," Sarah said with a smile. "I'm really proud of you, Marcus." The words filled Marcus with warmth. He didn't think he had ever felt as understood as he did in that moment. There was no need for pretense, no need to prove anything. He was allowed to be human. He was allowed to struggle and lean on those who cared about him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the semester continued, Marcus's life began to find a balance. The academic pressures were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. He continued to ask for help when he needed it, and he began to embrace the idea that taking care of himself, physically and mentally, was just as important as his academic success. With Sarah by his side, he found a new kind of strength in vulnerability. In their final study session before the semester's end, Marcus and Sarah found themselves sitting in the library once more. The tension of the early days had disappeared, replaced by a quiet camaraderie. "I'm not perfect," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "But I'm learning how to be okay with that. And that's more important than anything." Sarah smiled, her eyes warm with pride. "You're perfect just as you are, Marcus. And that's all anyone could ever ask for." For the first time, Marcus truly believed her. The weight of his fears, his insecurities, and his relentless drive for perfection had begun to lift. He had found something even more important, peace. And that was more than enough. The semester ended, and Marcus had made it through. Not just academically, but personally. And as he looked back on everything that had brought him here, his struggles, his triumphs, and the people who had supported him along the way, he realized that he was finally starting to understand the real lesson: success wasn't just about achievements. It was about the people who helped you rise when you fell, the ones who stood by your side through it all. And that was something he would carry with him long after graduation. The final exam week had arrived, and with it, the bittersweet realization that this chapter of Marcus's life was drawing to a close. He had survived one of the most challenging semesters he could remember, but in the process, he had learned more than just academic lessons. He had learned about resilience, vulnerability, and the importance of leaning on those who care. His grades were still important to him, but now, they didn't define his worth. He was learning to navigate life with balance and compassion for himself. As he sat in the student lounge, surrounded by the familiar hum of final exam stress and the frantic energy of his peers, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm. He had given his best, and he had accepted that whatever came next, he would be okay. This wasn't a feeling he'd experienced before. He had always been so focused on perfection, on achieving every goal without fail. But now, he understood that it was okay to fall short sometimes. It was okay to struggle and to ask for help when needed. And that, he realized, was the key to his growth. Sarah sat across from him, glancing up from her notes. She smiled at him, her eyes full of understanding. They had both worked hard this semester, but they had also made time to be there for each other, to help one another when things got tough. "You know," Sarah said, closing her notebook and leaning back in her chair, "I think we've come a long way, don't you?" Marcus nodded, reflecting on the journey they had been through together. "Yeah. It's been crazy, but I feel like I've learned more about myself than I ever expected to." Sarah laughed softly. "I think you've learned the most important lesson of all." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "That you don't have to do everything on your own," she said simply. "You've always been so determined to handle everything by yourself, but this semester, you've really shown that it's okay to ask for help. And that's how you grow, Marcus. That's how you succeed." He smiled at her, appreciating her perspective. "You're right. I've spent so much time trying to prove I could handle everything, but the truth is, I needed people like you, like my professors, like my friends. I don't think I would have made it without that support. And that's what's so great about this whole thing," Sarah continued. "You've finally learned that there's no shame in asking for help. It makes you stronger. I'm really proud of you, Marcus." His heart swelled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you. Seriously. You've been there for me through all of this. I don't even know how to thank you enough." "Just keep being you," she said with a smile. "That's all I need." The conversation shifted back to the exams, but the weight that had once hung over Marcus was gone. He felt like he was in control of his life again, and though he still had challenges ahead, he was no longer afraid of them. He knew how to handle stress, how to ask for help, and how to balance his goals with his mental and emotional health. He was, for the first time in a long time, at peace. The morning of his final physics exam, Marcus felt surprisingly calm. The pressure that had once consumed him no longer seemed like a looming threat. Instead, it was just another challenge, one that he was prepared for. He had spent the past few days reviewing his notes and meeting with his professors to clarify any lingering questions. And though he still had some nervous energy, it wasn't the same crushing weight he had once felt. When he entered the exam hall, he took a deep breath, letting the tension melt away. He was no longer in the fight-or-flight mode he had once lived in. Instead, he was ready. He had prepared to the best of his ability, and he knew that no matter what the outcome, he had done his best. That was enough. The exam passed in a blur. Marcus worked through each problem, taking his time and focusing on what he knew. The familiar anxiety was absent, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had put in the work. He finished the exam with a sense of relief, feeling as though a burden had been lifted. Afterward, he met Sarah in the campus cafe. Her exam had been over too, and she was sipping a cup of coffee, looking just as calm as he felt. "How was it?" she asked, looking up at him. Marcus grinned, his eyes sparkling with a sense of accomplishment. "It was fine. Honestly, I didn't feel like I was drowning in anxiety for once. I just did my best, and I'm good with that." Sarah laughed and reached across the table, offering him a high five. "That's the spirit. I knew you'd get there. You've come so far, Marcus. I'm proud of you." Marcus met her gaze, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Sarah. I couldn't have done it without your support. You've been with me through the worst, and you've helped me realize that I don't have to do everything by myself." "You don't have to, and you never did," she said with a gentle smile. "We're in this together." As the days passed, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything he had learned. The journey had been far from easy, but it had been one of the most important experiences of his life. He had grown in ways he hadn't expected, and he was proud of the person he was becoming. The pressure to be perfect had always been a part of him, but now, he understood that it wasn't about being flawless, it was about being human. When the final grades were posted, Marcus saw the results. He had passed his exams, and while his grades weren't perfect, they were more than enough to get him through the semester. He felt a deep sense of pride, not just in his academic achievements, but in the personal growth he had experienced. He looked at the grades for a moment, then closed his laptop with a smile. He had made it through the hardest part. But more importantly, he had found peace in the process. And that, he knew, was worth more than any grade could ever represent. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and Sarah continued to support one another. Graduation loomed on the horizon, and though there were still uncertainties about the future, Marcus felt a sense of calm. He knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. He had the strength, the support, and the lessons from this journey to carry him forward. As they sat together one last time before the semester ended, Sarah smiled at him, her eyes full of affection. "You've come so far, Marcus," she said softly. "I can't wait to see where you go next." Marcus looked at her, a deep sense of gratitude filling his heart. "I'm not sure what's next, but I know I'll be okay. Thanks to you, I've learned that it's not about having it all figured out. It's about taking the journey, leaning on those who care, and being okay with not having all the answers." Sarah smiled back, her eyes gleaming with pride. "You're ready for whatever comes next." "I know it." And as the two of them sat together, Marcus realized that he was ready. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt confident that he could handle whatever came his way. The road ahead was his to walk, and he was no longer afraid to take the first step. The day of graduation arrived. The campus, once a place filled with stress and long nights of studying, was now a place of celebration. Everywhere Marcus looked, students were gathering, their faces glowing with pride and anticipation. The familiar hum of the campus was now filled with the sound of excited chatter and the rustle of caps and gowns. As he walked across the quad toward the graduation ceremony, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: pride, excitement, and a tinge of sadness. This chapter of his life was closing, but he was ready for the next one. The lessons he had learned, about perseverance, vulnerability, and the strength of support, had shaped him into someone who no longer feared the unknown. He knew that the future, while uncertain, was full of potential. "Hey!" Sarah called out, waving to him from a group of friends near the ceremony entrance. "You made it." Marcus smiled, feeling his heart swell with affection for his friend. She had been his rock throughout this entire journey, and now, as they stood on the precipice of the future, he realized just how much she had helped him grow. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Marcus said, walking over to join her. Together, they joined the other graduates, finding their places in the sea of students preparing to walk across the stage. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, the air filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of celebratory music. As the ceremony began, Marcus couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had done it. He had made it through the challenges, the doubts, the pressure, and now, he was here. He was graduating. When his name was called, Marcus stood and walked toward the stage. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from nerves. It was from the overwhelming feeling of accomplishment, of everything he had worked for coming to fruition. As he shook hands with the dean and accepted his diploma, he paused for a moment, looking out over the crowd of family, friends, and fellow graduates. The world felt wide open, full of possibilities. He could hear his mom cheering from the stands, her voice filled with pride. His dad gave him a thumbs up from the back of the crowd, his face beaming with happiness. And then there was Sarah, her smile so bright that it seemed to light up the entire ceremony. She had been there for him from the very beginning, and now, she was sharing in this moment of triumph. When the ceremony ended, Marcus found his family and friends in the crowd, and they embraced, exchanging congratulations and heartfelt words. But even in the midst of all the excitement, Marcus couldn't help but think about what was next. Graduation marked the end of one chapter, but it also marked the beginning of another. And as he stood there, surrounded by those he loved, he knew that no matter where life took him, he had the tools to succeed. That evening, Marcus sat on the steps outside his apartment, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The sun had set, casting a warm golden glow over the city, and the streets below were filled with the sounds of celebration. It was surreal. It was over. He had made it. But as much as graduation was a moment to celebrate, it was also a moment for reflection. The Marcus who had walked into college 3 years ago was a very different person than the one who stood on those steps now. He had been lost then, driven by perfection and the fear of failure. But now, he had a sense of peace that came from knowing he was enough, just as he was. He thought about the people who had been there for him, his family, Sarah, his professors, and even the classmates who had shared the highs and lows of the journey. It wasn't just the grades or the accomplishments that made this moment special, it was the relationships he had built, the growth he had experienced, and the realization that success wasn't just about achieving perfection, it was about learning, growing, and finding balance along the way. In the weeks following graduation, Marcus took some time to figure out what came next. There were job offers to consider, internships to explore, and new cities to move to. But before diving into the next phase of his life, he took a moment to breathe. He wasn't rushing into anything. He knew that life was a journey, and it was okay to take a pause and figure out what he truly wanted. As he sat at his favorite cafe, sipping on a cup of coffee, Marcus couldn't help but smile. He had come so far. From the uncertainty and pressure of his freshman year to the calm confidence he felt now, he had learned to embrace the journey. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. His phone buzzed, and he looked down to see a message from Sarah. "You did it, Marcus. I'm so proud of you. Let's take on the next chapter together. I know we've got this." Marcus smiled and quickly typed a response. "Thanks, Sarah. Couldn't have done it without you. Here's to the next chapter." He hit send, feeling a sense of peace. He wasn't sure where life would take him, but one thing was certain, he wasn't alone. He had the support of the people who cared about him, and that was enough to face whatever came his way. The next few months were a blur of job interviews, decision-making, and new beginnings. Marcus decided to take a job offer in a city he had always wanted to explore, and he found an apartment that felt like the perfect new home. Sarah had taken a job in the same city, and the two of them made plans to stay connected and keep supporting each other as they navigated this new chapter. And as Marcus stood on the balcony of his new apartment one evening, looking out over the city, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't the fame, the fortune, or the accolades that brought him peace. It was the understanding that he had done his best, that he had learned and grown along the way, and that he had built a life filled with people who loved him, challenges that shaped him, and goals that pushed him forward. He had made it through the toughest times, and now, he was ready to face whatever came next. The future was wide open, and Marcus was ready to take the first step into it, confident that no matter where he went, he had the strength to succeed. And with that, he closed the door to the past and stepped into the future. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?